I'm being fined for hunting on my own land? Grady Locke curled his lip, one hand resting loosely on his gun. Then I'll just buy that trail you like so much, and shut it down for good. Don't breathe that HOA authority crap in my face again. Karen Munroe's voice trembled. You can't. That's community land. Community? Grady stepped forward, pointing at the ground. This is my father's land. You're just a tag-along. Behind him stood a large sign planted in the forest, each word painted in blood-red letters. Trespassers may be hunted down. Karen was used to imposing her will on others, but this time, she touched something she could never own, the self-respect of a man who doesn't bow. What state are you in? Where you live, does it have true community, real solidarity, or is that just an excuse to control everything, like Karen's HOA? The forest mist hadn't lifted. The ground beneath was still damp with night dew as Grady Locke stepped slowly through the weeds creeping over stone. Light filtered through the leaves in blurred slivers, the first ray of sun slicing across his arm like a gentle blade. The rifle hung silently on his shoulder, not overtly threatening, but clearly not ornamental. Grady's ears, sharper than any tracker's gear, had picked up the rustle in the underbrush before he even crossed the small ditch. A large animal, steady hoofbeats, slow breathing. It was a buck, at least 8 points. Grady stopped beneath a pine tree. The smell of rot and sap mingled in the air, stirring memories of old hunts with his father. He didn't aim, he just watched. Nothing urgent, nothing rushed. A bullet had never been his answer to everything. His finger brushed the trigger lightly, felt the cold metal against his skin, and did nothing more. High heels cracked sharply against the forest floor, like a thin metal blade slicing across the earth. Karen Munroe appeared, her posture tilted by the slope of the path. 2 HOA staffers followed close behind, one young man holding a camera, the other carrying a white sign bordered in red. HOA Preserve, no firearms allowed. Karen stopped exactly 7 paces away, holding the sign up like a command. This is a preserve under HOA jurisdiction. Firearms are strictly prohibited. You are in serious violation of Clause 3B. Her tone had that saccharine snap of someone long accustomed to issuing orders without being questioned. But Grady didn't respond on her terms. He stepped forward and pulled a thin paper from his chest pocket, unfolding it directly in front of them. A land survey, clearly marked and stamped by the Riverside County Assessor's Office. Karen glanced at it without pausing longer than 2 seconds on any part. Her mouth curled into a familiar smile, the kind worn by people who've won too many battles no one else wanted to fight. You might own the deed, she said, as if offering charity in the language of bureaucracy. But here, we own the fear. Every step you take, feel like a gun is pointed at them. And that's why they trust us, not you. Grady kept the paper in hand, but his eyes began to darken. It wasn't the words, but the voice so steeped in control. One of the HOA staffers raised a phone and hit record. The younger one spoke clearly. You're threatening us with a weapon. This footage is going straight to the resident group. Keep that rifle exactly where it is, Mr. Locke. The camera panned gently, locking focus on the rifle that had never been lowered. A perfect frame to slice and edit. Grady stared directly into the lens, his voice steady to the point of danger. I've never aimed at a person, but you're making me reconsider. It wasn't a threat. It was a reminder that the line between defense and resistance doesn't lie in a weapon, but in the arrogance of those who think laws exist only to protect their grip on control. In that moment, no one moved. The forest wind drifted softly, carrying the sound of a snapped branch, the sharp cry of birds rushing off the canopy, and the beat of a heart not Grady's. Karen swallowed dry, but she still didn't back down. I will file a report, and you'll have to explain yourself before the board. Grady gave a slight smile, his gaze unchanged. Then write it all down. Write that I stood on my own land, carrying the rifle my father once used to teach me how not to fire. Write that I was filmed while doing nothing wrong. Write your name too, Karen, because when this is over, your name will be the first thing they remember when they read that report. The staffer kept recording, but his hand holding the phone had started to tremble. Grady didn't need to do anything more. He turned his back and walked straight into the woods, each step leaving a clear print on the damp ground. No one followed. No one called after him. They stayed where they were, watching the figure fade into the pine brush, and for the first time since HOA signs went up along every road, someone hadn't stopped at the sound of their voice. When Grady reached the small cabin on the mountainside, he unshouldered the rifle and set it on the wooden rack where his father used to place it. He didn't say a word, just quietly wiped the smear of mud off the stock. His expression stayed calm, but beneath it, a decision had begun to take shape. If they wanted to fight with rules, he would show them the other face of the law, the part they had forgotten after living too long inside the comfort of control. And the bullet that hadn't been fired that morning would mark a turning point, not for blood, for the boundary. The cabin door closed, the hinge letting out a soft creak into the dimming light. In the forest, the warning sign still stood upright, but this time, it wasn't a threat to Grady. It was the first signal that those who use law to intimidate would one day be forced to answer to it themselves, not by gunfire, but by something heavier, intentional silence. Mornings in the northern mountains of Riverside were never loud, and Grady Locke didn't need an alarm to wake up. Light streamed through the dusty frosted glass, falling directly onto the wooden table where he kept his dagger and a land registry map. A yellow envelope lay there, stamped with the black HOA logo and sealed with dark red wax. It hadn't arrived like normal mail, but had been slid under the door, as if the sender didn't want to leave room for a reply. Grady opened it with one clean cut, no urgency, no curiosity. Inside was a violation notice, printed on paper, the wording precise to the line: unauthorized use of a firearm on HOA, managed public land, fine, $1,200. Payment due within 10 business days. At the bottom, italicized, non-compliance will result in permanent revocation of hunting and access rights. Grady placed the paper on the table, his fingers resting lightly on the corner like someone touching an unfired shell. He didn't show anger, but something different settled in his eyes. Not because of the fine or the warning, but because of the phrase, public land, printed in bold, as if a twisted definition could become truth through repetition. He folded the paper, slipped it into his jacket pocket, locked the rifle in a wooden chest, and started up the pickup truck. The tires rolled over the rough dirt road, each turn taken with a long, steady breath, as if he was feeling for every scar left by a system that had scraped across his life for too many years. The HOA office stood in the center of town, beside the coffee shop and bookstore, built of frosted glass and pale stone. A polished metal sign hung at the entrance, for a model community, HOA Green Hollow. When Grady walked in, he saw a line of residents standing in quiet order, most of them middle-aged white folks, neatly dressed, holding files. Some whispered in low voices, others stared into their phones. He didn't know any of them, but they knew him. A few glanced over their shoulders, a few lowered their eyes and pretended to be busy. No one greeted him, no one spoke. Grady stood at the end of the line without pushing, yet his presence shifted the air in the room. In that space, silence could be more unsettling than shouting. Karen Munroe stepped out of the meeting room with the stride of someone who had just finished an evaluation and knew she was always the one grading. Her hair was precisely combed, and her lavender suit stood out among the neutral tones. She scanned the lobby, her eyes locking onto Grady's still figure. She didn't ask anything, didn't smile, didn't hide her intent. She turned her head and spoke loudly enough for everyone to hear. Anyone bringing a weapon onto public land, no appointment, no service. Her gaze didn't leave Grady, as if every word she spoke was a brick laid into a wall only she could see. Grady stepped forward, not in a rush, not retreating. He stood at the reception desk, placed the fine notice on the glass counter, and spoke in an even tone like reciting a statute. "I'm here to ask about the land being called public. Specifically, the trail on the northeast side. The person who issued this notice needs to re-verify the boundary." One receptionist looked toward Karen, clearly not willing to act on her own. Karen stepped closer, her voice softer but still fully in control. "You may own a parcel of land, but that trail connects the neighborhood to the woods. It serves the community, and the HOA charter allows us to regulate any behavior that causes discomfort." Grady looked her in the eye. "Who do you think owns that land?" Karen didn't hesitate. She answered like casting a familiar spell, one she had repeated in dozens of meetings. "Whoever can use it has the right to it." The words dropped like a cold manifesto, indifferent to paperwork, borders, or reason. It wasn't an answer, it was a declaration of intent. Grady said nothing more. He picked up the fine notice, folded it neatly, and turned to leave. But just as he turned his shoulder, Karen's voice rose again, louder this time, aimed squarely at every ear in the room. "Maybe we should ask why he's still living alone out in the woods." Each word was a hook, scraping at dignity, suggesting, provoking, planting doubt. A few people in line turned to look. A man with glasses whispered something to his wife. No one spoke aloud, but the murmurs spread like ripples across still water. Karen remained in place, one corner of her mouth lifting in a half smile, like she had just set bait and was waiting for the trap to snap. Grady paused at the doorway. He didn't look back, but his hand tightened slightly on the handle. Then he pushed the door open and stepped outside, letting the midday sun strike down his back like a clear choice, either bow or stand tall all the way. Behind him, the HOA office remained calm, as if it hadn't just thrown cold water in the face of a man who only ever wanted silence and respect. When Grady returned to the cabin, he said nothing. He sat at the wooden table and laid out the land registry map again. His finger moved slowly along the trail, marking each intersection, each offshoot into the woods, and every section the HOA had never filed for use. Those points stood out clearly, like someone had unknowingly cleared a path for a legal counterstrike sharp enough to sting. Grady closed his eyes, leaned back in the chair, letting his breath settle, and in his mind, there was no anger anymore, only a plan. The forest at night wasn't completely dark, but it wasn't for the half-hearted. Moonlight tilted across the treetops, just enough to catch the damp glints underfoot, while all distance vanished into the scent of rotting wood, the shuffle of leaves, and the unsure heartbeat of someone unfamiliar with nature. But Grady Locke was no stranger to the forest, especially when he had belonged to it long before zoning maps in purple ink or HOA meetings dragged on. That night, he held a flashlight, its pale yellow beam touching each root, each ridge of earth, each faded footprint from the previous season. He wasn't tracking game, setting traps, or surveying. He was simply walking, like someone returning to a place he'd once been pushed out of, now needing to know who had stepped in after him. The path cut across the northeastern section, land his father had once marked off with birch posts and red paint, now showing no trace of the old boundary. In its place stood a thin wooden sign, newly fastened to 2 steel stakes driven into damp soil. The board bore neatly printed white letters, Walden Trail, HO community use only, no hunting, no private claims. The wording had the tone of a formal notice, but the presence felt like someone showing up uninvited to a dinner table. Grady stood still for a few seconds. His fingers brushed the surface of the board. The wood was fresh, barely touched by dew. The nails were clean, the glue still faintly pungent. It hadn't been up long, maybe just this morning, maybe yesterday afternoon. At the base of the post, a patch of grass was pressed down, roughly the size of a shoe. Grady examined it, then swept flashlight slowly across the nearby canopy. Beneath a bent branch tight against a pine trunk, he spotted something small protruding from the mossy bark. A hidden camera, battery-powered, palm-sized, with its lens fixed directly on the path enough to capture everything. Grady didn't say a word. He unlatched the device, coiled the wire neatly, then turned off his flashlight and took the trail back toward the cabin. He didn't need light to return. The path was etched into him like a habit that never needed to be relearned. Back at the cabin, Grady set the camera on the wooden table. The space was quiet except for the soft bubbling of water on the stove. He powered the device using a backup battery, and the basic interface appeared after a few blinks of red. The memory card held 3 clips, but only the second lasted more than a minute. He pressed play. The footage opened with Karen Munroe standing in the path just before dawn, lit dimly by a handheld flashlight. She wore a windbreaker, head slightly down, voice firm. Behind her stood about 6 people, some wearing gloves, one holding a shovel, another a flag, another carrying the wooden sign. Move quickly through the old man's land before sunrise. If anyone asks, say it's an old town access trail, public use. Leave no marks, no recordings. Post the sign and go. A male voice followed. You sure he won't be out early? Karen looked up, her eyes sharp as stone. He might go into the woods, but not when the whole neighborhood does. And if he does, HOA protects residents, not isolated individuals. Grady stopped the clip. His expression didn't change, but his hand slowly curled into a fist. He didn't need to hear more. They hadn't just pushed him off his own land. They had dressed the trespass up in words painted with false trust, protecting the community. Even more twisted, they had built fear out of the silence he had chosen, as if the one who doesn't speak is the one easiest to shove toward the edge. He stood up and opened the small storage shed behind the cabin. Inside was an old can of paint, the same one his father had once used to mark boundaries. He took the wooden sign he had removed, placed it on the workbench, and carefully painted 4 words with a fine bristle brush, each stroke firm, "Not your trail." No flourishes, no explanation, no warning. Just a plain statement. A period dropped at the end of every assumption made by people who thought access was a right that required no permission. It was nearly dawn when he brought the sign back into the forest. The early wind carried a strange chill, like the air itself sensed something had just shifted. He didn't post the sign in its old spot. He drove it into the center of the path right at the start of the Walden Trail, where every step would have to stop and read. And if anyone crossed after reading it, they would no longer be innocent. They would be choosing to ignore the truth that not everything belongs to the crowd just because they speak louder. Grady walked back without looking over his shoulder. To him, what needed to be said had been written, and this time, it couldn't be erased by another violation notice. Because no matter how many documents the HOA filed, they couldn't change the fact that maps don't lie, and land, no matter how many feet trample over it, remembers the first hand that touched it with the intent to protect, not possess. Early morning. The sun hadn't yet climbed past the ridge when a faint whimper made Grady Locke freeze in the yard. The wooden kennel door was ajar, the ground around it disturbed, with a thin trail of blood stretching from the cabin steps to the patch of grass near the forest's edge. Grady rushed forward, heart tightening as he saw Duke, the old, loyal hunting dog, lying on his side, left leg twitching, fur matted with blood at the elbow joint. Its mouth hung slightly open, breathing shallow and sharp, like something was pressing down on its chest. Its eyes were still bright, but that brightness had blended with pain, as if it had just been betrayed in the place it thought safest. He knelt down, checking every wound. No bite marks, no signs of a struggle with wild animals, but the scratches were even, clean, and oddly dry, nothing like an accident, and far from random. Something had been done on purpose. Grady carried Duke inside, laid him on an old blanket near the fireplace, then stepped back out to the kennel. On the ground was an unfamiliar scent, sharp and acrid, not natural. He recognized it after a few seconds: chemical cleaner. Beneath the kennel was a white smear, spreading like something had spilled, then been wiped away in a hurry. In a hunter's world, a mark like that was more chilling than a growl. Grady stepped back, his hand tightening slightly. He said nothing, went inside, and pulled up the footage from the security camera mounted outside. The system was simple, but always active. The timeline jumped to around 3 a.m. The night vision footage appeared. Karen Munroe. She wore a black coat with a hood, standing right in front of the dog's pen. In her hand was a long, cylindrical object with a cap, clearly a spray can. She looked around, hesitated, then leaned toward the kennel. The infrared light caught the blurred motion. Karen raised the can and sprayed twice. Duke let out a howl, trying to leap from the pen. She stepped back, turned, and disappeared toward the trail gate as if she'd never been there. Grady stared at the frozen frame, locked on the moment Duke's eyes burned into the back of the woman who had just sprayed him in the face. In that instant, he didn't see pain, he saw humiliation. Something had been taken without the chance to defend it. A strike at dignity, not just his, but the quiet life he had once chosen to live. Grady saved the video, slipped the USB into his shirt pocket, and returned to the cabin. Duke's breathing was weaker, but he still tried to lift his head. Grady sat beside him, hand resting on the dog's shoulder like a silent promise, then stood up. This time, he didn't head into the forest. He drove straight to the police station. The town station was open 24/7 but rarely busy. A young officer sat behind the desk, typing while chewing gum. When Grady walked in, the kid looked up and instinctively straightened under that gaze. "I'm here to report intentional harm to a personal animal, with camera evidence," Grady said, his voice low but heavy, like a verdict already prepared. The officer hesitated, took the USB, and plugged it into the computer. After just a few seconds of playback, he turned and said, "My supervisor's going to see this right away. Please have a seat." Tell. 15 minutes later, Lieutenant Ray Tucker, the man who had graduated in the same class as Grady, walked out. He didn't meet his old classmate's eyes, just gave a slight nod and motioned toward the room. Grady sat across the wooden desk. Tucker played the video to the end, then looked up. "We're seeing behavior that suggests trespassing on private property, possibly unlawful entry." But, he hesitated, a dog isn't a person. In this state, the law only applies if the pet is registered and suffers severe injury or death. In this case, it's hard to bring criminal charges. We can log the incident, but it'll likely be handled as a civil dispute. Grady looked him straight in the eye. What if the dog dies? Still civil, unless there's a direct witness, or a camera shot clear enough to confirm the act beyond doubt. "You don't think this is clear?" Tucker sighed, his tone softening. "I get it, but that's the law. Karen's the HOA president. She'll lawyer up. And I'm not sure this office is ready to open an investigation over a dog being sprayed with chemicals, even if it's a cowardly act." Grady stood. "Don't mistake this for being about a dog. This is a warning." Tucker stayed silent, watching his old friend turn and walk out, his shadow cast across the tile floor, colder than anything written into law. That afternoon, the air was still. Grady brought the wooden sign to the forest's edge, right at the entrance of HOA's so-called Walden Trail. He picked the highest patch of ground, drove the stake deep, wrapped the wire tight, and mounted the new sign. 4 words, painted bold, in letters 3 times the size of the old board. "Trespassers may be hunted down." Not a warning, not an invitation to debate, a boundary. Karen saw the sign later that day. She didn't come alone. 3 members of the HOA board were with her, along with a young patrol officer. They stopped in front of the sign. She pointed and shouted, "He's threatening the lives of residents. This is an armed threat of violence." The officer looked at the sign, then turned to Grady, who stood a few steps away, one hand resting on the rifle slung across his chest, not drawn, not cocked, just resting, as if it were part of him. "I haven't aimed at anyone," Grady said, his eyes locked on the group. "I'm aiming at the lie," Karen scoffed. "And who exactly are you accusing?" "Anyone who thinks that sign doesn't apply to them." For a moment, silence dropped like a stone across still water. Some residents stood farther back, snapping photos. A few filmed. Karen lowered her hand. Her tone lost its sharpness but grew more poisonous. "You think the law's going to protect that sign? The law won't, but the land will." The HOA community hall was packed that evening. A space usually reserved for gardening workshops or weekend bread giveaways now pulsed with tense whispers. On the large projector screen, a photo of the wooden sign with the words, "Trespassers may be hunted down," filled the frame. Karen Munroe stood in front, hands clasped on the podium, eyes sharp like a blade honed in the middle of a public hearing. She didn't raise her voice, but each word that left her mouth sounded like a command already written into a law waiting to pass. "This is a threat to life," Karen said, scanning the room. A direct threat to community safety, and this HOA board will not condone any act that puts residents in danger. An older man in the front row nodded reflexively. A woman nearby covered her mouth and winced slightly. The entire room seemed pulled into that one frame, where the rough white letters on dark wood stirred more than just warning it was a crack in the safety shell the neighborhood once prided itself on. Karen moved to the next slide. A still image of Grady Locke clipped from a video that had gone around that morning, standing before the warning sign, hand on his rifle strap, face unreadable. "This is not an isolated act," she said slowly. "This is the deliberate creation of a fear zone, a new boundary imposed by an armed individual, without community meeting, without permit, without legal consultation." A young man stood up, holding a thin folder. "Excuse me, I'm Casey from number 58. I just have one question. That land, who exactly owns it?" The question dropped into the room like water hitting the center of a bowl, setting off a wave of glances. Karen turned. "That land sits right at the edge of the residential zone. It's not on the internal property map, but for years, the community has used it for walking, nature observation, and small weekend camps. Continuous use creates usage rights, and that is the right we hold. But what if he has the deed?" Karen locked eyes with Casey, her tone quiet but so sharp it made him step back half a pace. "Usage rights create the value of living. If every forest and every trail is controlled by a single armed individual, then we are living in fear, dressed in legal terms." Another woman asked quietly, "But is that sign really a threat, or just his way of saying, 'Don't trespass'?" Karen didn't answer. Instead, she looked straight into the camera, recording the meeting, a live feed going to the HOA's internal platform, where hundreds of residents were watching from phones and living room TVs. "The question isn't whether that sign is a threat," Karen said, each word deliberate. "The question is whether we allow someone to use a gun to write their own rules in this community. If today it's the forest, tomorrow it could be the neighborhood. One man alone cannot define our boundaries. And if we don't respond now, we are legalizing control through fear." At the back of the hall, a few people clapped, others stayed silent. But the wave had already begun. At the same time, deep in the woods, faint light from the round bulb above the cabin spilled through the evening mist. Grady stood beside a wooden post he had just set, his hands still streaked with wet paint. The new sign was larger than the first, its surface sanded smooth, the lettering more even and much clearer. "Private area. All access is monitored." No more veiled warnings, no more suggestions. This time, it was confirmation the cameras were back, mounted stronger, clearer, and capable of catching every breath. After hanging the sign, Grady stepped back and viewed it from a distance. The wind moved gently through the leaves, carrying the sound of small footsteps. Duke shuffled out from behind a bush, his legs still bandaged but steadier now. The dog stopped in front of the sign, looked up at it, then turned back toward the cabin, as if he understood this was where he had bled, and this time no one would pass without being seen. Grady tapped the post lightly, his eyes steady. It wasn't fear. It was known that when the intruder thinks they're the victim, any act of defense will be labeled a threat. But between staying silent and letting others redraw the map, or speaking up to hold the line, he had never chosen wrong. And the bigger question was no longer who held more rights. It was, who's afraid of whom? Late afternoon. The sun hadn't set, but the forest had already sunk into a smoky bronze hue. On a broken tree trunk near the lower clearing, a phone was strapped in place with wire and dull tape. The lens pointed toward the gap between two oak trees where the private land, no trespassing sign had just been replaced that morning, the white paint still not fully dry. In the frame, Karen Munroe appeared as if she knew she was expected. She wore a coat, face visibly irritated, her eyes openly sizing up the warning sign like it had personally insulted her. She marched straight up, grabbed one edge of the wood, and yanked. The sign popped off the post, as if it had never belonged there. Karen raised it high like a trophy, turned to someone off screen, and snapped, "I'm the HOA. I decide what's public." The person filming said nothing, but that 14-second clip was uploaded to a resident group at 3 p.m. Less than 10 minutes later, it was reposted to a national land rights forum. An hour after that, it surfaced on Reddit, then Twitter. Within 3 more hours, it had over 20,000 shares, 300,000 views, and nearly 1,000 furious comments. The first caption paired with the video was simple: "Karen owns nature now." Those 6 words, the story moved beyond the HOA. It was no longer a small clash between a lone resident and a civil organization. Now it was the image of a white woman, acting in the name of community, ripping down a man's ownership warning on camera, with the confidence of someone who didn't believe she could be wrong. Public reaction is split in two. One side was outraged. This is a private property violation. There's video evidence, and no one has the right to cross into private land and destroy posted signs. Lawyers, journalists, and former park officers began sharing the video, adding sharp commentary. One wrote, "This meets civil suit criteria at minimum for trespass, and more if intent to intimidate is proven." Oh, but the second wave of responses, quieter, colder, raised deeper questions. If the man behind that sign had been white, wealthy, and living in a suburban mansion instead of a forest cabin, would Karen have dared to rip down that sign and declare power like that? Another post put it plainly, "Why is it that when a black man carries a gun for protection, it's a threat, but when a white woman destroys property, it's called community defense?" Grady said nothing. He knew the video was spreading, knew his name was being repeated across hundreds of comments, but he didn't repost it, didn't explain, didn't respond. That evening, he simply sat on the cabin steps, with Duke resting his head on his leg, the dog's eyes still tired, brighter than the day before. Wind moved through the pine branches, carrying the sound of distant cars. Grady rested his hand on the rifle beside him, not as a threat, but out of habit, a quiet reminder that boundaries aren't just drawn on land, but in every action that follows. The HOA board responded with a mass email the following morning. The subject line read, "Warning about misinformation." The message was short. The video circulating on social media appears to have been edited and taken out of context. "We urge residents not to share it further and remind everyone, carrying a weapon does not mean understanding the law. The HOA will pursue legal action if defamatory behavior continues." The email made some residents hesitate, but most had already seen the video and the images spoke for themselves. No amount of editing could fabricate the words, "I'm the HOA, I decide what's public." No special effects could fake Karen's expression as she ripped down the sign and threw it like garbage. No argument could convince the community that the one who destroyed property was somehow the one protecting it. A group of law students from a nearby university shared the clip with the caption, "If you need a case study in power imbalance during a civil dispute, this is the most vivid one you'll find." A high school teacher in another state used the video as a civics essay prompt. How far does your right to limit someone else's right go, and who decides if that right is real? On Reddit, one user wrote, "This isn't about Grady. It's about how a system allows someone to believe they're always right just because they represent the community." That comment alone received over 1,000 likes. Grady still didn't respond, but his action the next morning spoke for him. At the spot where the private land sign had been torn down, he didn't rehang the old board. He installed a new post, nearly 2 meters tall, solid and fixed deep into the ground. The new sign was bolted in place, painted deep red, with white block letters, "Trespassers are recorded. Violators will be identified." He didn't need to warn who would be hunted, he only needed people to know. Every step was now tracked, every action backed by evidence. Karen didn't return to the woods. In following HOA meetings, she shifted her criticism to online forces attacking personal integrity. She repeated often that the internet is fake, but the HOA is real. That line was clipped into a meme posted with a still of her ripping the sign and spread faster than the original video. The original uploader of the video never revealed their identity, but residents had begun quietly submitting more photos, clips, and old maps online. The story was no longer Grady versus Karen. It had become a story about boundaries, about who gets to redraw the map, about how a single voice, if heard loud enough, can force an entire system to take another look. One day after the video of Karen ripping down the sign spread like wildfire, a 27-minute analysis appeared on YouTube from an independent attorney. A white man in his 40s, wearing thin-rimmed glasses and a gray button-up shirt, stood in front of a zoning map of the county. He didn't need to raise his voice. The argument was built layer by layer, with evidence each boundary line re-examined through public data. "This is the cadastral map updated last quarter by the county planning office," he said, moving his cursor over a thin red outline. "This land is registered to Grady Locke. On the other side, where the HOA claims their so-called Walden Eco-Stop, there is no legal deed. They just use it. They've never had the legal right." The video spread quickly through legal forums and community groups. Within 10 hours, it had over 100,000 views and thousands of comments thanking him for setting the record straight. A law professor reposted it with the caption, "This is not a personal feud between Grady and Karen. This is a literal fight for land control." It didn't stop there. A local resident named Jackson posted an old photo to a Facebook group. It showed a group hike led by Karen 2 years ago. She wore athletic gear and stood in the center of hikers holding a signboard. Beneath the photo, a handwritten note read, "Ecological walk, $10 per person, HOA fundraiser." His caption asked, "I remember thinking it was odd at the time why fundraise from land the HOA never bought." A highlighted comment below read, "I got kicked out once for asking if that toll station was tax registered." Another added, "If Karen charged people to walk through Grady's forest, then it's not just trespass. It's profiting off someone else's land." The story began to shift. No one was talking about the "trespassers may be hunted down" sign anymore. Instead, attention turned to a bigger question. Can a civil organization unilaterally use, manage, and even profit from land it doesn't legally own. The local paper, which had remained silent, joined in. A series titled Beneath the Green Moss began publishing. The first article was headlined, "Fined for Hunting on His Own Land." The opening line read, "When a man living alone in the woods was fined $1,200 for carrying a gun, no one asked what the map said. Now we have to ask, who's really hunting whom?" The paper dug deeper. A reporter interviewed longtime residents, collecting accounts of routine hikes that required conservation fees, about how no hunting, community land signs only appeared last year, and that before that, no one had ever called it an HOA trail. A retired woman named Martha said, "Karen's great at organizing, I won't deny that. But once I asked, who owns this land? She just said, we've cared for it for 10 years. It's ours." When asked if she had ever seen documentation, Martha shook her head. "I never have." While the press and public buzzed, Grady didn't respond to any calls or messages. He didn't show up in social media groups, didn't issue statements on any platform. His cabin lights stayed on each evening. The dogs still barked when strangers came near, and the forest behind the house remained as quiet as ever. There was only one change. On the narrow path leading to the eastern section of his land, where people often cut through the fence to reach the residential area, Grady put up a new wooden sign. It stood at eye level, painted in deep earth tones, with cold white letters. "I was fined for standing on my land. I'm just returning the favor." No one knew when he posted it. No one caught the moment on camera. But the first to see it was a delivery driver, who snapped a photo and posted it on TikTok with the caption, "Forest old man claps back so hard Karen went silent." The video reached 1.5 million views in just 12 hours. Grady's language wasn't long, loud, or in need of explanation. One sentence, 6 words, summed up the entire journey from being unfairly fined to staying silent, to finally responding, at the right time, in the right way, nothing more, nothing less. The public began asking, why hasn't Karen responded officially? Why is the HOA silent? Are they trying to retroactively legitimize their use of land now that the truth is out? Or have they realized this battle can't be won with collective authority when the facts have escaped their control? At the HOA headquarters, closed-door meetings became more frequent. Many residents, especially younger ones, started raising questions during community sessions. Where did we go wrong? Why do we keep calling it an HOA trail with no legal proof? Who decided to find Grady and under what clause? Karen began skipping meeting. A temporary assistant was appointed in her place, repeatedly emphasizing that all actions are based on internal policy, and we are reviewing the entire land record. Meanwhile, investigative articles kept coming. One new piece was titled, "The Invisible Trail, HOA, Boundaries, and the Right to Stay Silent." In it, the journalist flipped the question, if Grady carried a gun, but never fired, never threatened, then why does every gaze still see him as the threat? The article closed with this reflection. Grady hasn't spoken, but what he builds, writes, and refuses to do speaks for a whole class of people once overrun in silence. At the forest's edge, Grady stood beside the new warning sign, eyes fixed on the clearing where Karen once stood. Duke lay by his feet, ears perked, as if listening to something beyond the wind. Grady said nothing, but his eyes, his stance, and the words etched into wood were enough to make it clear that what had once been pushed into shadow was now coming back into the light. The morning was still. Sunlight slanted through the thick canopy of trees in the eastern section, where Grady had first posted a sign. Weeds had grown tall around the old trail, prints fading like fragments of memory people preferred to forget. Duke lay stretched beside the cabin door, eyes half closed, ears flicking at the sound of tires crunching gravel in the distance. Grady didn't step out. He stood in the shadow inside, watching through resin-specked glass as a silver SUV pulled up at the forest's edge. Karen stepped out first. She wasn't alone. A man Grady didn't recognize followed a few paces behind, wearing a thick coat, neatly parted hair, and dark sunglasses. They didn't enter Grady's land, didn't cross the third warning sign posted the week before. The man bent down and gently placed a white envelope on a flat stone near the trail entrance, right where a wild hen's nest had been the year before. Karen said something quietly, likely meant only for the man beside her. Then they turned and left. Grady stepped out after the car had vanished behind the pines. He didn't open the envelope. He didn't need to. On the back, bold print read, "OA Community Proposal, Confidential, Property Purchase." He stared at the paper for a few seconds, then flicked his old Zippo. Blue flame licked the page, spreading orange heat to its edges. Grady set it down in the middle of the trail. A light breeze turned the fire into a long streak of ash across the dark soil. Not a word was spoken. The next day, a certified envelope arrived at the cabin's mailbox. The HOA logo is embossed on thick paper. Inside was an urgent hearing request, accompanied by a formal complaint accusing Grady of posing a threat to communal living, undermining neighborhood spirit, and inciting division among residents. The tone wasn't aggressive aggressive, but it carried the polished weight of bureaucracy, the kind of language meant to make someone feel like the problem, not the victim. Grady folded the letter and slid it into his coat pocket. That afternoon, he shut the cabin door and climbed into his old pickup. Duke didn't follow. Grady drove out to the highway, crossed 2 small bridges, and reached the town administration center. At the land office, people recognized him immediately, not because he was famous, but because someone from the local newspaper had already called ahead. That man Grady Locke might be coming in to buy more land. Please handle his paperwork carefully. The receptionist pointed toward a room at the end of the hall, where dull light fell over an empty conference table. Grady set down a stack of documents. No speeches. Everything was in order. Proof of ownership for the existing parcel, satellite maps showing the trails the HOA had been using, documentation of no active disputes, and a formal purchase proposal for the remaining northern forest land. The file clerk skimmed the papers, then asked one final question. Are you sure? That's the most contested area. There was once an application to zone it for community ecological use. Grady nodded. If someone applied and didn't get it, then no one owns it. The signature hit the last page in complete silence. As the pen lifted, the clerk looked up. So as of today, the entire Walden Trail system, including its connectors, overflow parking, and side access lanes, is now private property, under the name Grady Locke. No one in the office said anything else. No one needed to. By the time Grady left town, dusk had fallen. Wind moved softly through the tall trees, the leaves whispering like the voice of the land itself. Duke ran out to greet him, sniffed at his pant leg, then returned to lie by the porch. Grady placed a hand on the dog's head, his gaze not on the cabin, but turned north toward the woods, where no one would step again without thinking. The next day, in a brief but symbolic post, the local newspaper wrote, "The story began with a $1,200 violation. It ends, for now, with a transaction no one dares to price." The final line read, "Who defines the spirit of community when the one cast out is the only one who followed the rules?" Karen never returned to the forest's edge. The man who accompanied her disappeared as if he'd never existed, but the offer to buy land, the accusation of undermining community spirit, and the failure to control the narrative all remained, like a mirror for anyone who ever believed power belonged only to the side with more people. Grady didn't post any more signs. He didn't change the boundary, didn't build a fence, but the locals understood without being told. The old path was no longer a trail. The one once seen as a threat was now the rightful owner of the land the community had claimed as theirs. It wasn't a victory of anger, it was the response of intentional silence, a resistance that never had to raise its voice. And if anyone asked how many acres Grady had bought, the answer wouldn't be found in a number. It would be in the fact that he didn't have to sell, didn't have to move, and never had to bargain with money, because some things once crossed are answered not with words, but with action. Night fell slowly over the northern forest, where city lights couldn't reach, and the sound of insects became the only warning. Along the old hiking trail path, freshly posted warning signs still carried the smell of drying paint. Grady locked the cabin before full dark, checked the camera batteries again, then slid the wooden gate latch into place. Duke followed close behind, silent as the forest itself. Just over an hour later, a strange sound echoed from the distance, not animal footsteps, but human. The south camera recorded everything. A group of 5 residents, 2 men and 3 women, came through carrying flashlights and a large printed map. They moved in a line, openly. The lead man pointed repeatedly at side trails that once led to birdwatching spots or small rest areas designed by the old HOA. When they neared one of Grady's warning signs, the group paused. The oldest woman, likely the one who planned it, reached out and touched the white-painted letters on the dark wood. "Trespassers may be hunted down." Her hand trembled slightly, but stayed there, as if to prove something to the silent camera overhead. They didn't destroy anything. No wires cut, no fences crossed, no steps beyond the line. But their presence, late at night, on fully registered private property, was enough to count as trespassing. The next morning, Grady submitted the footage to the county sheriff. No formal complaint attached, just a USB drive and a copy of his ownership documents. The officer on duty reviewed it several times, then forwarded it to the main office. By late afternoon, an official notice was posted on the local information portal. Residents are reminded to respect the boundaries of private land, regardless of past familiarity. Unauthorized access is not only a civil violation, but in some cases may carry criminal consequences. No arrests were made, no names listed, but the message was clear enough for anyone still unsure roaming freely through the woods was over. That evening, Grady sat outside the cabin, firelight casting his shadow against the oak tree behind him. On the table lay the printed police notice, and a still image from the camera, the hand resting on the warning. He felt no anger, no satisfaction. Just folded the paper and slipped it into an old field notebook he'd kept since his recon days. Every time something mattered, he added a note not for revenge, but to track the ways people justify crossing the clearest line of all: ownership. Across town, Karen was holding a quiet meeting with a few core members of the former HOA. News of the notice spread quickly, turning what was meant to be a discussion about community access rights into something more introspective. If that land's no longer ours, what are we even trying to defend? Karen tried to stay firm, saying the law could change, that the community could apply pressure, but the eyes facing her no longer held the same conviction. A middle-aged man stood, speaking softly as he left. "I used to think he was the threat, but if he's not the landowner, why are we the ones climbing the fence?" Grady didn't know about the meeting, and he didn't care. Night had fallen deep. He put out the fire, stepped inside the cabin, and locked the door. On the table sat a folded piece of paper where a new warning sign draft was printed. This time, it wasn't a threat. It was a reminder, because maybe the most dangerous thing wasn't a man with a gun, but a man with nothing left to lose except the land once dismissed as unimportant. News of the residents trespassing in the forest quickly reached local media. A few small television stations picked up the story, running headlines like "Forest Land Dispute Ignites" and "Beloved Trail Now Off Limits." On a morning live stream, Karen Munroe appeared, no longer composed like she had been at HOA meetings. She sat in her usual office, a Greenfield Community First sign behind her, voice sharper than usual. When asked about the police statement, Karen didn't hide her outrage. Who are the police protecting? A man walking through the woods with a gun? A guy putting up signs threatening our neighbors? She clenched her hands and stared directly into the lens. Are they protecting the man with the gun or protecting fear itself? On the other side of the screen, an independent journalist, not part of any major outlet, spoke calmly, cutting through the anger. Or are they protecting the law? The question wasn't sarcastic. It was a clean cut through the tension in the room. Karen paused for several seconds, then turned to the producer and signaled to end the interview. The broadcast was cut short, but that clip quickly spread across social media. Comments flooded in. "If you're not trespassing, what's there to fear about a warning sign? No one got hurt, what's wrong with being reminded?" And the simpler, "Law applies in the forest too." In the cabin near the old trail's edge, Grady didn't watch television, but he heard the sharp brakes of a car in the distance, footsteps stopping at the fence line, someone reading aloud the fresh letters on the newest sign. Wind swept over the wooden board and echoed the words, "This land was never yours. You just got used to taking." He didn't want to justify himself anymore. The words weren't meant to intimidate or explain. They were a conclusion. A conclusion for those who had grown too used to stepping onto others' land without thinking, who had shaped the meaning of community to excuse any act of entitled appropriation. Karen understood that. She saw the new sign the next morning as she drove past in her personal vehicle, didn't saint up, but couldn't help looking. The sentence didn't need to be in all caps to strip something from her. The sense of entitlement she thought was permanent, the right to walk, to give orders, to impose the version of order she believed was correct. She sat still in the car for several minutes, staring into the woods where she used to lead tours, collect fees, and host outdoor events. Every entrance was now sealed with wooden fencing, no barbed wire, no locks, but the message was clear. It's not yours anymore. That day, in another press conference, a county police representative confirmed, "We don't take sides, but private property rights are the foundation of this state's law. When provoked, people may react, but if you cross legal boundaries, consequences are inevitable." The media quickly seized on that statement to push the debate further. Who really crossed the line? Was it Grady, with his hardline signs, or was it the community that had long assumed the trail was theirs? Karen gave no further interviews afterward, but that silence began to unravel the image of a community protector she had spent so long building. Meanwhile, Grady kept patrolling the boundary markers. He no longer carried the long rifle, just a knife at his belt and a small notebook. Every new warning sign put up was marked in the notebook, not to count rights, but to mark the moments when people chose to step back, not out of fear, but understanding. At the end of the day, he stopped beside the sign he'd installed that morning, wiped the dust off the white letters with his bare hand, then turned back toward the cabin. No one was behind him, no cameras were rolling, but it felt as if the entire forest had settled behind him like a witness to a quiet withdrawal, not a victory, not a defeat, just a boundary left standing. Those who've grown used to taking will always struggle when reminded it was never theirs to begin with. Morning in the woods near the edge of town began with the scent of mist mixed with damp timber, but that day the air carried something else, a fracture. The local newspaper, usually filled with dated weather blurbs and community notices, suddenly received an anonymous email. The sender left no name, only a brief line. Justice doesn't always need to shout, just needs the right timing. Attached was a scanned internal meeting transcript from the HOA 2 weeks earlier. In it, Karen Munroe's name appeared beside a clear statement. If we can't buy the land, we'll sue until he sells out of exhaustion. No metaphors, no filters. A strategy of legal pressure made plain exactly how many HOAs operated behind closed doors until someone shone a light on it. The leaked document was quickly verified as real. The local paper didn't go overboard with the headline. They simply ran, "Sue until he breaks. What does the HOA want from the man with the land?" But the internet moved faster than print. Within 6 hours, the entire transcript spread across social media. Those who had supported the HOA fell silent. Those who had criticized Grady now hesitated, revisiting the timeline and asking, was what they called community spirit just another form of trespass disguised in legal language? The hashtag number #TrailNotYours shot to the top on several platforms. Among thousands of posts, one tweet was shared over 50,000 times. They called him the threat, but who's really plotting to ruin someone just to take his land? Another post showed the sign that read, "This land was never yours. You just got used to taking," with the caption, "That line was never wrong." Amid the flood, an old clip from the previous month resurfaced. Karen standing in a HOA meeting, declaring that residents have a traditional right to access the forest. The video hadn't changed, but its meaning had flipped entirely in the eyes of the public. In the cabin halfway up the slope, Grady received a printed copy of the leaked email from an old friend who worked at the county legal office. He didn't say a word. He just set the paper down on the table and tapped his hand lightly on the folder as if to mark it. Nearby, his notebook lay open, filled with neatly written entries going back to the first week of it all. Not a plan, just a record who said what, who did what, and who crossed the line first. To Grady, truth didn't need explanation. It only needed to arrive at the right place, at the right moment, and stand still like an old tree, solid no matter how many times the wind changed. Karen was different. That afternoon she was intercepted by a reporter as she stepped out of her car, the camera sharp, the voice still polite. "Can you confirm whether you said, 'Sue until he sells out of exhaustion'?" Karen turned away, gave no reply. A passing resident whispered to a friend, loud enough for the mic to catch. So all of this was just to force him out. Public opinion turned faster than Karen could respond. The people who once wore the HOA's purple shirts now began removing their pins, staying silent during meetings. Online, old photos from Karen's guided hikes were reposted with sarcastic captions. "Touring someone else's land, now demanding ownership." Grady didn't retaliate. He didn't sue, didn't appear in public, didn't post a single response. Instead, the next morning, he walked into the woods and put up a new sign, small, not brightly painted, just a single line in black ink. "Silence builds stronger fences than lawyers ever could." People photographed the sign as a soft but irrefutable rebuttal. Everyone understood his silence had never been weakness. It was the choice of someone who understood the limits of words and when the truth would speak for itself without being pushed. By the end of the day, Karen sent an internal statement to the remaining HOA members, claiming the leaked transcript had been edited and didn't reflect the full context of the meeting. But no one stepped up to defend her. Her words now weren't read as those of a leader, but of someone trying to deny what was already clear. At the following meetings, Karen's chair still sat in the center, but the seats around it gradually emptied. Because once trust is broken, no amount of speech can patch over the spreading cracks. And Grady, as always, stepped back across the wooden fence toward his cabin, carrying nothing but an old notebook and silent eyes. He understood that warning signs and legal papers weren't what made people hesitate. It was the moment they realized they'd grown used to living on something that never belonged to them, and suddenly, the person once seen as a problem had the right to say, "Stop." The HOA's press conference was held in the town's familiar hall, the same one that had hosted dozens of civic discussions. But today the air was heavier than usual. Karen Munroe stepped up to the podium with a poster behind her that read, "Together we keep the community safe." Camera lights hit her face, which no longer held its usual confidence. She opened with a cold statement. "We were taken out of context, misrepresented." Every sentence spreading online has been pulled from its full meaning. The room fell silent for a few seconds, not out of conviction, but because everyone was waiting to hear what Karen would say next to deny what was already obvious. A council member beside her nodded, trying to project unity, but at that moment, a woman from the audience spoke softly, but loud enough for the whole room. "Are we still the victims?" The question hit like metal against stone. A small sound, but one that made everyone turn. No one answered. because to answer would mean admitting the fear they once clung to had changed direction. And the man they called dangerous was acting with more reason than the system meant to represent them. Meanwhile, a thick envelope was delivered to the county courthouse. The filer was the legal representative of Grady Locke, a small law office known for countersuing HOAs. The contents were simple but firm: a request to investigate and take action on 3 specific grounds: abuse of authority under the guise of self-governance, harassment through the misuse of administrative tools, and intentional defamation via public media. The filing wasn't written in anger, but as a legal shield raised after months of endurance. Not for retaliation, but to state clearly, the limits of the law exist to protect, not to attack the silent. When news of the countersuit surfaced, social media lit up. Those who had once shared Grady's warning signs now began posting excerpts from the legal filing, captioned with lines like, "Finally, someone teaching the HOA a lesson with the same tools they use to silence others." Community groups that had previously criticized Grady began publishing more neutral content, analyzing the situation in legal terms instead of emotion. A retired lawyer posted a breakdown that got over 2,000 shares, concluding, "Grady was pushed back step by step, and when he stepped forward with the law, the system must now answer not just to him, but to all of us." Karen didn't speak to the press. She avoided public appearances, leaving all statements to the HOA's communications team, but public opinion had shifted. Those who once defended the right to access the forest now began to realize they'd never really asked what that right was based on. Questions like, who actually owns the trail? And why does the HOA get to bar someone from living on their own land? Began to appear more frequently. The silence around the HOA was no longer a sign of unity. It had become a symptom of doubt. Back in the cabin at the forest's edge, Grady went on living as usual. He didn't make any further statements, and ND didn't react to praise online. The only thing he did was put up another small wooden sign, placed near the entrance, once used for hiking. It read simply, "Silence is not surrender, it's a warning." No signature, no explanation. But everyone who passed by understood this man wasn't silent out of weakness. He stayed quiet because he knew that sometimes, to win, you don't need to shout louder, you just need to stand longer. And this time, he stood in the forest, in the heaviest silence of a community that once believed it held the power. The courtroom was packed that day. Wooden benches along the aisle were full, and some people had to stand against the wall. The air inside was tight as a drawn string, though no one raised their voice. Karen Munroe entered first, wearing her familiar purple suit, followed by 3 HOA representatives in matching outfit. They sat on the plaintiff's side, faces tense, hands clasped, eyes betraying unease. They were used to managing a community, but this time they were facing a federal judge, not a town hall where voices carried decisions. Karen didn't look at anyone, not even Grady, who sat calmly on the defendant's side, dark shirt, hand resting on a file with carefully tabbed pages. Judge Callahan, known for presiding over the county's major land disputes, opened the session by emphasizing the provisional nature of the hearing. "This is not a final ruling. We are here to determine whether the defendant has the right to post warning signs and deny community access, or if the plaintiff has legal grounds to request immediate court intervention." His voice was steady, neither fast nor soft, but every word carried weight. Karen spoke first. Her tone was firm as she argued that the "trespassers may be hunted down" sign was an indirect threat to residents' safety, and that the trail through the forest was a cultural asset used by the community for over a decade. She cited meeting records, resident statements, and photos of guided walks to argue that while the trail may not legally belong to the HOA, it had become an essential part of their way of life. The judge nodded, took notes, then asked the defense to speak. Grady stood, opting to speak for himself. He spoke slowly, eyes fixed on the judge, each word clear. "I didn't put up that sign to threaten anyone. I put it up after my private property was trespassed, my animal was injured, and my dignity was mocked in public." He placed a plat map on the evidence table, clearly marking boundary lines, purchase dates, and a notarized land deed. "That land belongs to me, bought with real money, through proper procedure. Familiar use doesn't erase ownership." He handed over a USB drive, explaining it contained footage from a trailside camera showing Karen leading a group through the property at night, along with an audio clip where she said, "If we can't buy it, we'll make him back out." The judge ordered the clerk to play the video. The courtroom fell silent, the screen's light reflecting off faces. There was Karen, in athletic wear, pointing the way, her voice audible through rustling leaves. "This is a narrow stretch. Move quickly before sunrise." An HOA member asked, "Are we being recorded?" Karen's voice replied, "He lives alone. No way he's got a system." When the video ended, No one spoke. Karen stared at the floor, hands clenched. The judge did not issue a ruling right away. He took notes, then asked only 2 questions. Is there any evidence that the defendant ever used force? No, Your Honor. Then is denying access to land they legally own a violation of any statute? The HOA's attorney stayed silent, then shook his head. Finally, the judge spoke briefly. The warning sign will remain in place until a final decision is reached. Ownership cannot be replaced by habit, and this court cannot endorse invoking the community to dismiss the law. Karen stood, but not as briskly as when she entered. Behind her, a few residents left their seats before she reached the aisle. Grady didn't look at them. He packed his documents, nodded to the judge, and exited the courtroom as if closing a chapter no one expected would be written in legal ink. But he knew this was just the beginning. The fight wasn't over. But at least, he had forced them to play by the rules. And when the law is called by name, it belongs to the one who endures longest. The air in the courtroom thickened as the HOA's attorney stood, voice clipped, patience worn thin. We are not here to argue property lines, he said, glancing at Grady, then turning to the judge. We are talking about community, a body shaped by culture, habit, connection. If someone can suddenly post a warning, block a trail walked by generations, just because of a deed, then this is no longer personal liberty, it is a radicalization of ownership. The room paused for a beat. Some residents nodded slightly, others exchanged uncertain glances, as if unsure where the truth now stood. But in the middle of it all, Grady didn't move. He knew the story had gone far beyond property boundaries. It had become a test whether the law stood for reason or would cave to sentiment. Judge Callahan met the attorney's gaze directly. He lifted the gavel and struck it once on the worn wood surface. The sound rang dry but firm. Law is not determined by collective emotion. Law is based on evidence, lawful rights, and clearly defined boundaries. He paused, eyes on the folder in front of him, then continued, weighing each word. The land belongs to Mr. Grady Locke. Ownership is fully confirmed by cadastral records, a certified deed of transfer, and faces no legal dispute at this time. Any individual or organization entering that land without the owner's consent, even for walking or preserving tradition, is trespassing. And trespass, under state law, is a violation. He turned his gaze to Karen, whose face had turned pale, eyes fixed on the floor, hands clenching the edge of her coat until her knuckles turned white. Not a word was spoken. Therefore, the judge said, his voice calm but sharp as a blade, the court denies the request to remove the warning sign and affirms Mr. Locke's legal authority to post access restriction notices. The court also acknowledges the submitted evidence regarding acts of trespassing that have already occurred. Today's hearing concludes with this clear statement. No individual or organization is permitted to set foot on that land without the direct consent of the owner. The second strike of the gavel echoed through the courtroom, and this time, no one dared to breathe too loudly. Karen didn't react. She rose slowly, her face pale as paper, eyes stripped of the sharpness and cold control she once carried. A few HOA members quietly slipped from their seats and followed her out, their steps uncertain. They were no longer in control. No one in the courtroom clapped, no one spoke loudly, but something had shifted like ripples across a lake after a stone has dropped slow, quiet, spreading outward. Grady sat for a moment longer, his hand resting lightly on the folder, as if making sure everything that just happened was real. He didn't smile, didn't show victory. He only gave the judge a small nod, then rose and walked toward the exit, back straight, steps unhurried. Outside the courthouse, the afternoon sun was soft over the long steps. A few photographers raised their cameras, but he didn't stop. Grady didn't need a photo to prove anything. To him, the judge's words were enough. The silence now was justice, enforced not needing banners or slogans. What he knew, though, was that what he had protected wasn't just land. It was a principle. Everyone has a boundary. And if no one stands to draw that boundary, what gets lost isn't just a forest. It's the right to exist, quietly, on your own ground. The courtroom was packed that day. Wooden benches along the aisle were full, and some people had to stand against the wall. The air inside was tight as a drawn string, though no one raised their voice. Karen Munroe entered first, wearing her familiar purple suit, followed by 3 HOA representatives in matching outfits. They sat on the plaintiff's side, faces tense, hands clasped, eyes betraying unease. They were used to managing a community, but this time they were facing a federal judge, not a town hall where voices carried decisions. Karen didn't look at anyone, not even Grady, who sat calmly on the defendant's side, dark shirt, hand resting on a file with carefully tabbed pages. Judge Callahan, known for presiding over the county's major land disputes, opened the session by emphasizing the provisional nature of the hearing. This is not a final ruling. We are here to determine whether the defendant has the right to post warning signs and deny community access, or if the plaintiff has legal grounds to request immediate court intervention. His voice was steady, neither fast nor soft, but every word carried weight. Karen spoke first. Her tone was firm as she argued that the "trespassers may be hunted down" sign was an indirect threat to residents' safety, and that the trail through the forest was a cultural asset used by the community for over a decade. She cited meeting records, resident statements, and photos of guided walks to argue that while the trail may not legally belong to the HOA, it had become an essential part of their way of life. The judge nodded, took notes, then asked the defense to speak. Grady stood, opting to speak for himself. He spoke slowly, eyes fixed on the judge, each word clear. "I didn't put up that sign to threaten anyone. I put it up after my private property was trespassed. My animal was injured, and my dignity was mocked in public." He placed a plat map on the evidence table, clearly marking boundary lines, purchase dates, and a notarized land deed. "That land belongs to me, bought with real money, through proper procedure. Familiar use doesn't erase ownership." He handed over a USB drive, explaining it contained footage from a trailside camera showing Karen leading a group through the property at night, along with an audio clip where she said, "If we can't buy it, we'll make him back out." The judge ordered the clerk to play the video. The courtroom fell silent, the screen's light reflecting off faces. There was Karen in athletic wear, pointing the way, her voice audible through rustling leaves. "This is a narrow stretch. Move quickly before sunrise." An HOA member asked, "Are we being recorded?" Karen's voice replied, "He lives alone. No way he's got a system." When the video ended, no one spoke. Karen stared at the floor, hands clenched. The judge did not issue a ruling right away. He took notes, then asked only 2 questions. "Is there any evidence that the defendant ever used force?" "No, Your Honor." "Then is denying access to land they legally own a violation of any statute?" The HOA's attorney stayed silent, then shook his head. Finally, the judge spoke briefly. "The warning sign will remain in place until a final decision is reached. Ownership cannot be replaced by habit, and this court cannot endorse invoking the community to dismiss the law." Karen stood, but not as briskly as when she entered. Behind her, a few residents left their seats before she reached the aisle. Grady didn't look at them. He packed his documents, nodded to the judge, and exited the courtroom as if closing a chapter no one expected would be written in legal ink. But he knew this was just the beginning. The fight wasn't over. But at least, he had forced them to play by the rules, and when the law is called by name, it belongs to the one who endures longest. The air in the courtroom thickened as the HOA's attorney stood, voice clipped, patience worn thin. "We are not here to argue property lines," he said, glancing at Grady, then turning to the judge. "We are talking about community, a body shaped by culture, habit, connection. If someone can suddenly post a warning, block a trail, walked by generations, just because of a deed, then this is no longer personal liberty, it is a radicalization of ownership." The room paused for a beat. Some residents nodded slightly, others exchanged uncertain glances, as if unsure where the truth now stood. But in the middle of it all, Grady didn't move. He knew the story had gone far beyond property boundaries. It had become a test whether the law stood for reason or would cave to sentiment. Judge Callahan met the attorney's gaze direct. He lifted the gavel and struck it once on the worn wood surface. The sound rang dry but firm. "Law is not determined by collective emotion. Law is based on evidence, lawful rights, and clearly defined boundaries." He paused, eyes on the folder in front of him, then continued, weighing each word. "The land belongs to Mr. Grady Locke. Ownership is fully confirmed by cadastral records, a certified deed of transfer, and faces no legal dispute at this time. Any individual or organization entering that land without the owner's consent, even for walking or preserving tradition, is trespassing, and trespass, under state law, is a violation." He turned his gaze to Karen, whose face had turned pale, eyes fixed on the floor, hands clenching the edge of her coat until her knuckles turned white. Not a word was spoken. "Therefore," the judge said, his voice calm but sharp as a blade, "the court denies the request to remove the warning sign and affirms Mr. Locke's legal authority to post access restriction notices. The court also acknowledges the submitted evidence regarding acts of trespassing that have already occurred. Today's hearing concludes with this clear statement. No individual or organization is permitted to set foot on that land without the direct consent of the owner." The second strike of the gavel echoed through the courtroom, and this time, no one dared to breathe too loudly. Karen didn't react. She rose slowly, her face pale as paper, eyes stripped of the sharpness and cold control she once carried. A few HOA members quietly slipped from their seats and followed her out, their steps uncertain. They were no longer in control. No one in the courtroom clapped, no one spoke loudly, but something had shifted like ripples across a lake after a stone has dropped slow, quiet, spreading outward. Grady sat for a moment longer, his hand resting lightly on the folder, as if making sure everything that just happened was real. He didn't smile, didn't show victory. He only gave the judge a small nod, then rose and walked toward the exit, back straight, steps unhurried. Outside the courthouse, the afternoon sun was soft over the long steps. A few photographers raised their cameras, but he didn't stop. Grady didn't need a photo to prove anything. To him, the judge's words were enough. The silence now was justice, enforced not needing banners or slogans. What he knew, though, was that what he had protected wasn't just land. It was a principle. Everyone has a boundary, and if no one stands to draw that boundary, what gets lost isn't just a forest. It's the right to exist, quietly, on your own ground. The leaked messages didn't appear first in mainstream media, but on a small forum dedicated to tracking local HOA activity. The post came from a young investigative reporter named Eliza Tran, who had previously covered land profiteering cases near neighboring towns. She received a chain of emails from an anonymous source, the most notable being one sent from Karen Munroe's personal address to a real estate developer. Subject line: Trail Access Opportunity. In the body, Karen used no flowery language. She wrote plainly, "If we pressure the current landowner into compromise, I can open access from the south. That would create nearly $2 million in value for the pending project." No mention of Grady Locke, no talk of community or walkability rights, just numbers and phrases like expected ROI, internal access priority, and infrastructure expansion potential. Eliza didn't publish right away. She spent 2 days contacting the land office, zoning firms, and using email tracing tools to verify the source. Everything matched. The article finally ran in the town paper's independent column with a mild headline, "Green Access or Shortcut to Investment," but its contents shook the dormant ground under the Grady HOA dispute. In it, Eliza aligned the date Karen sent the email with the HOA's timeline of legal action, showing the protests, citations, and pressure campaigns almost perfectly overlapped with Karen's negotiations over potential trial-based profits. The piece spread quickly, but the response this time wasn't rage, it was cautious silence from the community. Green Hollow residents didn't riot or protest, they simply began asking each other in neighborhood chats, "If the trail was never ours, why are we funding a fight for someone else's gain?" Some quietly reviewed their community fund contributions, discovering trail maintenance items with no detailed reporting. An older couple, once the largest donors to the Green Corridor Fund, publicly requested to retract their final grant, citing lack of clarity in fund usage. Karen stayed silent, but unlike before, silence no longer maintained her control. At Wednesday's HOA meeting, only 8 people showed up, less than half the usual number. One member proposed, "We need to clarify that email, otherwise the whole board looks like a front for commercial goals." Karen replied, "We were just seeking expanded access for the community." For the first time, someone interrupted, "By forcing a landowner to sell through lawsuits?" At the forest's edge, Grady kept to his usual schedule. He didn't speak to reporters, post online, or stoke the public. But the next morning, a new wooden sign appeared at the second fork in the trail, the path that had once sparked the dispute. It didn't contain any prohibitions, just a single line in hand-painted white: "Don't call it nature if you're counting profit." People took photos, shared them, and debated the meaning. Some called it philosophy, others saw it as a warning, but to those who had followed the case, they knew. It was Grady's way of ending a long dispute without raising his voice, without needing to win because he had never entered to win. He just wanted to hold on to something that had never carried a market price, never needed to be defined by HOA bylaws or property appraisals. And now, as the truth began surfacing through clipped emails and long-term ambitions, people realized, sometimes, the one carrying the gun is the least threatening of all. News of the leaked emails didn't stop at the town border. When the state legal journal ran Eliza's article on its front page under the headline, "Using HOAs to Seize Real Estate Profits," a flood of comments came in from readers statewide. Most didn't know Karen or Green Hollow, but they recognized the pattern. Opaque HOA meetings, vague dues, stories told through quiet power. A nonprofit legal organization immediately got involved. Within 48 hours, they filed a motion for a new civil suit, citing evidence that Karen Munroe had used the name of the community to push policy, exert pressure, and position herself for personal gain in land negotiation. The filing stated, if confirmed, using an HOA as a front for commercial leverage not only violates community ethics, but may constitute systemic civil fraud. The district court accepted the filing and called an emergency session. Media crowded the courthouse. National outlets began dispatching reporters to Green Hollow. No one saw this as a simple land dispute anymore. The case of Grady being fined for standing on his own land had become a trigger, exposing a poorly regulated HOA power structure. In a subsequent emergency internal meeting, the HOA tried to hold its image. One representative said, "We respect the law and will cooperate with the investigation." But the residents no longer listened the same way. A new grassroots coalition, calling itself Hollow for Truth, formed to demand a full audit of HOA finances from the past 3 years and to temporarily suspend Karen from her position pending the outcome of the investigation. Karen didn't appear at the public meeting that day. Her house sat at the end of a small road, set apart from the other homes. The front door was shut. But early the next morning, someone nailed a wooden sign to the tree in her front yard. Bold white letters read, "Trail thief, go walk elsewhere." No signature, no one came forward. But the message was unmistakable. It wasn't a threat, it was a stripping of honor, the only form of protest left to residents who couldn't take her to court but still needed to speak. The next leaked message from within the HOA revealed that over a third of board members were considering resignation. One wrote, "We can't defend someone when all evidence shows they turned this place into a personal launchpad." The local newspaper listed Karen's guided hiking tours, which had charged fees but never reported them, previously framed as community tradition. Now, everything was being re-examined in a new light, no longer as environmental dedication, but as a calculated strategy to build value for a deal that never materialized. On Grady's side, there was still no official statement. He made a brief appearance at his attorney's office that afternoon, then withdrew into the woods, as usual. But his silence was no longer seen as avoidance. It was the kind of silence that made people ask themselves, why are the loudest ones always the ones with something to hide? The warning signs remained in place. This land was never yours. You just got used to taking. Now read not just as a declaration of ownership, but as a reminder for anyone who had ever believed that power entitled them to encroach. The court, the media, the residents, even those who once believed Karen, all now stood at a crossroads where truth and fabrication could no longer coexist. And in the middle of it all, the man once labeled a loner, the eccentric in the woods, had become the center of the most honest public reckoning Green Hollow had ever seen. Grady Locke still lived in the old wooden cabin, deep in the woods, far from noise and cameras. When a major television network invited him for a primetime live interview, aiming to clarify the controversy dividing the community, Grady's response was a handwritten note, folded in half and delivered through his attorney's office. Just 5 words. "This story doesn't need me." The host, a seasoned media figure with decades of experience, paused on screen and asked plainly, "Don't you want people to understand you?" But Grady wasn't watching. He was walking along the stream bank, where his father once left simple fish traps, and blackened stones still marked the last fire they built. His silence wasn't a rejection of media, it was the only way to preserve a life that never needed proving in the first place. In a world where everyone tries to speak louder, Grady chose to say nothing, and that's exactly what made people start listening closely to you. The next morning, the local paper ran the headline, "Fined for Hunting, now a symbol of the right to silence." Alongside it was a profile photo of Grady, eyes turned away from the lens, silver hair, and a frost-dusted mustache. Below the article, thousands of comments, many defending him, calling him the keeper of the line between freedom and control. But others still questioned, if he won't speak, how do we know what's true? In the midst of it, Karen Munroe, for the first time in weeks, addressed the media publicly. She spoke in a tired voice. "I don't deny there were communication mistakes, but the HOA exists to protect community values, not to enrich anyone." Yet when asked about the email involving the real estate developer, she declined to answer. That same day, the attorney representing a group of residents filed to expand the investigation, requesting a review of contributions made to the board in previous years. An elderly resident stood to speak at a civil town forum. "We've been silent too long, but silence isn't consent, and Grady helped us see that." In the woods, the warning signs remained, but people no longer saw them as threats. A group of law students, on a field visit studying private land rights, left a note at the base of one sign, "Thank you for holding the truth by not saying too much." From someone once labeled a threat to public safety, Grady had become a symbol of the firm boundary between individual rights and the misuse of collective authority. And then, amid all the meetings, arguments, and analysis, Grady still said nothing. He just kept living, clearing the land around his home, removing the old sign with faded letters, and putting up a new, simpler one, "Free to walk. Ask first." It wasn't forgiveness. It was a reminder that freedom begins with respect, and that if silence can be a weapon for those misunderstood, it can also be the final fence between people and ambition. Grady's silence was no longer a wall. It was a mirror reflecting all the voices trying to redraw the lines between right and wrong. There was nothing left to say, because in truth, everything had started with silence. And sometimes, that silence is what makes a whole community stop and ask itself, did we forget who owns this land, and why? Grady's assistant appeared briefly in a small frame on the weekend news. Her voice was steady and clear, with not a trace of drama, as if reading back a transcript, not answering a question. But when the anchor asked, "Does he think the public misunderstood him?" she just smiled and replied, "He doesn't need them to understand, he just needs them not to step on his land." The answer left the studio quiet for a moment, as if someone had rung a small bell in a noisy crowd. On social media, the clip was shared tens of thousands of times, accompanied by the caption, "Doesn't need to be loved, just needs to be respected." Meanwhile, outside the eastern edge of the property, Grady permanently closed the path that once cut through the old forest. No warning, no explanation, just a whiteboard nailed to an aged trunk, painted with a single dark question mark. No words, no name, no entry. That silence, again, unsettled people. Some called it a challenge, some called it closure, but most began to grow quiet themselves. They stopped asking, they stopped stepping in. At meetings, the HOA cooled down. Fundraisers for the Green Trail saw fewer attendees. One former supporter of Karen's group posted bluntly on the public forum, "Maybe we need to ask, why would someone lock up the woods with a question mark?" The post stayed pinned to the top of the page for a full week. No one took it down. A simple sentence that somehow captured how the whole community felt: confused, ashamed, and for the first time self-aware. Karen didn't respond to the press. Her house stayed closed, curtains drawn. No new signs, no slogans, but someone saw her at the window late one night, holding a glass of wine, looking toward the forest. Not everyone caught her expression clearly, but a neighbor recalled that, for the first time in years, she wasn't smiling. And to those who'd once been scolded by her in public meetings, that brought a strange feeling, not satisfaction, but closure. A week later, the local court announced the case between the HOA and Grady was closed. No further complaints, no appeals. All parties withdrew voluntarily. One article wrapped up the matter with a single line, a story about ownership, about patience, and about the final boundary between the individual and the collective. Meanwhile, the dirt path around Grady's house lay covered in dry leaves. Some people still came, stood outside, didn't cross over, just looked at the board with the question mark and turned away. Some called it philosophy, some said it was a warning, but Grady said nothing. He just kept camping in his part of the forest, lighting fires, checking cameras, and occasionally leaving a small bouquet of flowers at the base of the sign, no name attached. Maybe it was for his father. Maybe for the first person who ever asked to pass through by calling him by name, not calling him the landowner. The whiteboard became a symbol in the area. A group of high school students used it as the subject for their senior essay. The only real question is, who got used to walking in without asking? The paper won first prize. Their teacher shared that when she read the final paragraph, she paused for several minutes. Not out of emotion, but because she realized she too had once walked through that land as a student and had never stopped to ask who lived beyond the trees. A story closed with a board that had no words. But its echo was a lasting reminder of boundaries, of presence, of the right to be undisturbed on one's own land, without needing signs, explanations, or to be understood. And maybe, as Grady's assistant once said, sometimes what a person needs most is simply for others not to touch the place they call home. The HOA board re-election took place on a cold gray afternoon, when spring was supposed to bring the season's first sunlight and the scent of fresh grass after rain. But the community hall was quieter than in past years. Voices murmured instead of buzzing. On the registration table was a short list of unfamiliar candidates, names unknown to residents once used to a presence that needed no introduction: Karen Munroe. No one nominated her, no one objected. They simply skimmed the ballot, checked off a name they had no reason to fear. Fewer than a third of residents came to vote. The usual cheerleaders for community conservation initiatives were absent. A few who did show up came only out of curiosity, but no one asked where Karen was. No one asked if she still lived in the neighborhood. They behaved as if her name had been a page turned and closed, without the need for a bookmark. After the election, a brief notice was posted on the community bulletin board. The new HOA board will review all governance policies to ensure transparency, neutrality, and no private gain. The notice had no logo, no chairperson's signature. It read like a quiet pledge, written for those who had once felt excluded from the boundaries of us. Subsequent meetings were shorter too. No one stood up to speak in a raised voice. No arguments broke out over limiting trail use or raising area management fees. People said what was necessary, then quietly left, as if the shadow of an old era still lingered, reminding them that noise doesn't always bring order. Meanwhile, the northern forest remained still. Grady Locke no longer appeared in the news, wrote no articles, and sent no more letters. He quietly cleared the old trail but didn't reopen it. No new signs, no electric fences. Just a few logs lay across, like a gentle message that the path was no longer public. A few younger residents who had once walked in came back, bowed their heads, and turned around. Not out of fear, but because they now understood. There are boundaries that don't need signs to make people stop. A local child, in an assignment on silent heroes, chose Grady. The essay read, "He didn't save anyone, he didn't cast spells, but he didn't let anyone steal the most important thing, not land, but the silence everyone needs." The teacher shared it on the school forum, and a few parents from the neighborhood sent apology messages to Grady, even if none had personally caused harm. It was a form of acknowledgement, quiet but clear, that some wrongs must be made right, even without being named. And so spring arrived, without the HOA festival, without signs lining the trail. Only the birds returned, and sunlight filtered through the trees. No one sang praises of the peace, but it was there undeniable and unquestioned. In that silence, the HOA still existed, but as an empty frame, waiting for something new to begin. As for the name Karen, though not erased from the records, it no longer lived in the collective memory. No one needed to ban it, because no one cared to say it anymore. 1 week after the election, while the air still carried a chill from the changing season, a new sign was posted at the entrance to the neighborhood, right at the path that once led to the forest trail. White background, red letters, no community trail beyond this point. It bore no HOA seal, and it wasn't a court order. It was part of a new policy the incoming board called silent reordering, a polished phrase for a quiet retreat from the disputed land the organization had once thrown into chaos. But beneath that warning sign, someone had scrawled a line in black paint, messy, origin unknown, maybe we never had one. That line, brief as it was, seemed to hold the entire truth of what had happened. A bitter, cold, and painful confession that maybe there had never really been such a thing as community here. Maybe it had all just been a fresh coat of paint over greed, control, and the illusion of authority. No one erased the writing. No one wiped it away. It stayed, like a thin crack that, the longer you looked, revealed itself to run all the way through the foundation. Grady didn't leave his house during those days. He didn't have to do anything more. His silence was doing the work better than any statement could. A few who had once opposed him were now using their voices to undo former decisions. Contributions to the Green Space Preservation Fund were being reconsidered. The HOA's operational records from the past 3 years were undergoing an internal audit. Signs labeled Karen's Conservation Path were taken down without ceremony. And Grady, deep in his cabin in the woods, heard it all without stepping outside. He didn't smile, didn't nod in satisfaction. He just kept realigning the warped window frame in the storm, fixing the bent fence, and lighting his wood stove with torn pages from old newspapers. Some reporters came by, hoping for an interview, but all of them left with the same note. Homeowner declined media contact. One even left a business card with a handwritten line, "You're rewriting the meaning of ownership." But Grady didn't respond, because from the start, he'd never meant to write anything. He was just holding on to what was already his, the right to live on the land his father once walked, without explaining or asking anyone's permission. As the HOA lost its grip, residents began redefining community rights for themselves. They held small gatherings, with no need for official approval. Some groups began asking, if we let a few people speak on our behalf, when did we ever really speak for ourselves? And then they realized what made them uneasy wasn't that Grady carried a gun, but that he was the only one not afraid of being misunderstood. He didn't try to explain, didn't ask for agreement, and didn't need forgiveness, and because of that, he forced them to look at themselves. Meanwhile, the line beneath the sign, "Maybe we never had one," remained like a question no one had the courage to answer, but also one no one dared to deny. In the quiet of a neighborhood once boiling with arguments, what remained was caution and wariness. That spring, people didn't talk about festival decoration. They talked about boundaries, about identity, and about who really had the right to decide what belonged to everyone. And after everything, the answer still wasn't clear, or maybe it was, but no one wanted to say it out loud. Early in the morning, when dew still clung to the tops of wild grasses at the forest's edge, a group of local students, representing the science class of the county high school, sent a handwritten letter. In it, they asked Grady for permission to conduct a geological study on the land he owned, clearly stating their academic purpose, along with a pledge not to film, not to share any coordinates, and to strictly follow all instructions. They didn't ask for a right-of-way, they asked for consent. Grady read the letter, folded it carefully, then wrote 3 lines. "Yes, but not the old path. I'll show a new one." When the students arrived, Grady didn't meet them at the gate. A quiet man emerged from behind the canopy, pointed northeast where the old trail had been fenced off with woven wood and warning signs in 3 languages. He didn't offer any further explanation, just motioned them to follow. The students hesitated for a moment, then instinctively lined up and followed the gray-haired man with a canvas bag slung over his shoulder and a steady stride, as if he knew every dry twig on the ground by heart. The path Grady led them through had no name, no sign, and was far from easy. The weeds reached knee-height, and some sections required them to duck under low-hanging branches. But no one complained. The air carried the feel of a journey built on respect, rather than a visit with a fixed itinerary. When they reached a clearing where traces of sedimentary rock had once been noted, the students began their work, collecting samples, taking notes. Grady sat at the edge of the clearing, a few steps away, never interfering. He observed from a distance, as if he were watching something beyond the rocks and soil, something about human presence in a space no longer belonging to any collective except to stillness. One student approached, holding a water bottle and wearing a slightly hesitant look. "Mr. Grady," he began, his voice low but clear, "I heard the story about the old trail. I just wanted to ask, don't you miss it? Because it used to be where everyone walked." Grady didn't look at him. His gaze stretched toward a distant point where the old trail had once begun beneath a moss-covered wooden arch. Then he replied, softly, but with clarity, "People don't miss the path. They miss the feeling that they could walk in any time without knocking." The student stood quietly, then nodded, asking nothing more. When the research wrapped up, the group packed their gear, collected all their trash, and left no footprints behind. Before leaving, one girl pulled a small stone from her backpack, its surface etched with a fine blade, came, took nothing, left nothing, except gratitude. Grady accepted it without a word. He placed the stone into a hollow in a tree along the path, where light pierced just enough for the message to be visible if someone walked the right way. The story of the student group didn't go viral. They didn't post about it, didn't take commemorative photos. But a few weeks later, a high school teacher sent Grady a thank you letter, stating, "The students didn't just learn about geology, they learned about boundaries, and that silence isn't always refusal." Around the same time, a few former residents quietly returned to the forest edge, not venturing in, just standing at a distance, as if trying to acknowledge something they had once overlooked. No one crossed the sign, no one climbed the fence. Their eyes simply settled on the no-trail access board, then lingered long on the messy, black-painted words beneath it. Conversations at the cafe down the street began shifting in tone too, from blame to quiet, from certainty to hesitation. For Grady, everything continued as usual. He went into the forest at dawn, fed the dogs, repaired the roof of the cabin, and sometimes stood for a long time looking toward the path once labeled Public Trail. He didn't write a book, nor did he appear in any documentary, despite a few requests. To him, the story didn't need a main character. It only needed to end the way it should have, all along with boundaries acknowledged, silence respected, and footsteps unafraid when there's an invitation. Autumn arrived, the forest changed color, and for the first time in months, there were no emails offering to buy the land, no legal letters, no new warning signs. Instead, there was something else, a quiet space between people who once clashed now with no reason left to do so again. Grady stood still for a long time after answering the guide's question. In the stillness of the forest, the sound of distant birds, the wind through the canopy, and even the scratch of a pencil on paper were clear. He stepped off the moss-covered stone, eyes not meeting anyone, but his voice spoke out, as if to himself, "I regret what once was mine being defined by someone else." It wasn't a complaint. It was the distilled truth of a long series of shifts, of silences interrupted, of standing at the edge between keeping and letting go. No one replied. No one needed to. A student quietly copied that line into the last page of his notebook, then ended with a smaller line, slanted in the corner. "Those who protect land rarely say much." As the group prepared to leave, the teacher turned back and bowed slightly to Grady, but he only nodded, avoiding eye contact. On the way out, no one spoke. Not because the forest demanded silence, but because each step reminded them, just because something was once easy to enter didn't mean it should have been. When the wooden gate appeared through the underbrush, no one felt regret. They understood the trip wasn't about geology, it was about finally understanding a boundary long misread, the boundary of respect. A few days later, a short excerpt appeared on the school bulletin board, unsigned and uncaptioned, just one line. "Some people don't need to be understood, as long as others don't trample what they're trying to keep." No one knew who posted it, but many students stopped to read. A few people who had joined past hiking trips read it too, and were surprised by the quiet feeling it left behind. Meanwhile, on the other side of the forest, Grady planted another wooden stake, no sign, no warning. He gently tapped the top into the ground using the wooden mallet his father left him. His face showed no particular expression, but every movement was slow, deliberate, like a ritual. When he finished, he stood facing the large oak tree that had once been a gathering spot for residents, where unauthorized picnics took place in past years. Now, no one sat there anymore. Only a thin layer of young grass had started to grow back, covering tire tracks and old footprints. Grady looked at it for a long time, then turned away. He wasn't trying to erase the past, but he wouldn't let it dictate how the future unfolded on this land. That night, as the warm light glowed through the cabin window, Grady placed the notebook a student had left behind on the kitchen table. He didn't read beyond the last line, which quoted his own words, and beneath it, a small note. "We didn't know we were walking on a boundary until the landowner stopped staying silent." He closed the notebook and slipped it back into the envelope to send it to the school. Outside, the forest wind blew steadily. No new signs had gone up. But everyone now understood the important thing wasn't the sign. It was the shift in how people entered the woods with permission, with quiet, and with an awareness that familiarity doesn't grant entitlement. Grady didn't need to put up another message. He held the land, and the land held the silence he chose. In that forest, what was most protected wasn't a physical boundary, but the boundary within people, and that, from now on, had been written down not on a wooden board, but in the way people told the story without saying his name. Grady Locke's name didn't appear in major news articles. There were no long interviews about legal victory, no videos of him raising his hand in front of a crowd. But when a land rights organization sent him an invitation to speak at their annual conference in Austin, what they received in return was a small slip of paper. No title, no greeting, just 6 handwritten words in faded black ink. I didn't fight back, I stood still. The sentence, seemingly quiet, quickly spread like a slow fire touching dry grass in a drought. People started quoting it, printing it on flags, t-shirts, taping it inside truck windshields, carving it onto tree trunks, and nailing it to small wooden boards near the old trail entrance that once led into Grady's land. No one shouted for justice anymore. They were silent, but their eyes had changed. They no longer looked at the forest as a public amenity to enter at will, but as something long mistaken as common, when in truth, it had never belonged to them. A group of law students from a southern university chose Grady's case as their research project. In their final presentation, the group leader ended with the line, "Grady Locke didn't reclaim his land, he just stood still, so those who pushed in would realize they were the ones who had gone too far." The room went silent, no applause, but everyone wrote the sentence down. Later, academic papers frequently cited the phrase, "stood still," as a new legal idea, a form of passive resistance, where personal sovereignty holds its ground against collective pressure masked as community goodwill. Veteran attorneys called it a symbol of boundaries, not the kind made offensive, but of resolve when a person neither retaliates nor yields, and forces those advancing on them to examine their own path. In the woods, Grady put up no new signs, but residents began posting small wooden boards, made from reclaimed wood, quoting things he once said, snippets of conversations that had gone unheard. One read, "Whoever can use it has the right," with a reply underneath, "Using is not the same as owning." Another board quoted Karen, "We own the fear of the residents," followed by bolder writing, "but not their silence." The signs weren't signed, but everyone knew they were responses, not attacks, but reminders of how a community once claimed authority over someone else's land simply because it felt familiar. Karen vanished from public view. Her house was still in the neighborhood, but the curtain stayed shut, the lawn grew wild, and her mailbox was often plastered with small paper notes, not insults, not threats, just quotes. One day it would read, "Maybe we never had one." Another day, "This land was never yours." No one knew who wrote them, but she understood each line was a mirror reflecting the actions she once led. People no longer cared how many lawsuits she faced or when the next hearing would be. What people cared about was that the forest still stood, quiet, untouched by development, uncut by trails, and no longer defined by anyone except the one who kept it. A few new members of the HOA proposed issuing a public apology to Grady, but before the letter could be sent, someone placed a wooden sign at the front gate of the HOA office. "Apologies don't open closed gates." A group of local educators proposed including the case in the civics and law curriculum not as an event, but as an ethics lesson. One teacher who had taken students into the forest the previous year said, "This is a story about ownership, but more deeply, about moral boundaries, the line between using something and believing you own it." Small groups began hosting experience, sharing sessions about property rights, from forest rangers to farmers, retired firefighters to former HOA members who had stepped down. Grady's story was no longer a lawsuit. It had become a method of learning about standing still as a form of action. At the edge of the forest, where a dried-up creek once served as a scout gathering spot, someone quietly placed a small stone marker. No date, no name, just one line carved into it. "The land remembers." And it was true. That land hadn't been forgotten. It remained there, now marked by softer footsteps, hushed voices instead of arguments, and quiet respect replacing entitlement. Grady didn't step out of the forest to tell the story, but everyone who passed through became a teller of it for someone else without exaggeration, without justification. Because they had seen it, someone had chosen to stand still, to return what was never theirs to take, and that was the only way to keep it. The last days of fall passed in silence, the forest golden as if it had never seen dispute, and the trail leading into Grady's land no longer showed prints from strangers' shoes. At the forest's edge, the sign still stood, "Private property, all access monitored," quiet in the morning mist. No more angry protests, no more emergency meetings with voices sharpened by blame. Only cars slow down when passing by. Some drivers eased up, looked at the sign for a long time, then nodded silently as if acknowledging something. Others didn't get out, but rolled down their windows, gazed at the treetops, and softly repeated, "Stood still." No one told them to. No one reminded them to change. But they had changed. Those who once opposed Grady, supported Karen, signed the petition to reopen reopened the trail, and had now become quiet witnesses to something they hadn't seen at first, that a boundary isn't always drawn in barbed wire. Sometimes, it's just where decency is pushed too far. Grady didn't take down any of the warning signs. Even though no one trespassed anymore, no more legal threats came, and even as the HOA had dissolved half of its functions, he left every word on those boards untouched, like living records, proof of a moment when a man chose neither to yield nor to attack. Some called it stubbornness, but those who had ever sat before a judge, who had received rulings for trespassing on private land, knew well, those signs weren't meant to intimidate, but to remind. To remind that every single word posted had only gone up after too many spoken ones had been ignored. One October afternoon, Mrs. Summers, the fiercest critic at the very first meeting, pulled over by the roadside, stepped out, and stood facing the sign that read, "I was fined for standing on my land. I'm just returning the favor." She didn't speak, didn't call out Grady's name, just stood there for a few minutes before returning to her car. When asked by a local reporter, she simply said, "I used to think he was extreme. Now I think we were too casual about rights that were never ours." The quote wasn't officially published, but a secretly recorded clip of her statement was shared online, quickly spreading under the title, "How to Apologize Without Saying Sorry." Grady didn't respond. He still left the house early each morning, walked several miles along the forest's edge, checked his cameras, adjusted the barbed wire, and sat on the old rock his father once placed. The newest sign stood at the base of the forest's largest oak, no words, just a single palm facing down, the military signal for stop. At its foot was a single deep boot print, identity unknown, but with no steps leading forward. People said it was Grady's, and that boot print was his final statement, that sometimes stepping back is the last boundary a person can put up to avoid losing themselves. A group of sociology students once tried to reach him, sending letters requesting an interview, but all received the same reply from Grady's secretary: "No one represents silence." That answer became the topic of new academic research: silence as a form of resistance, not in dialogue, not in condemnation, not in rallying, but in forcing others to confront their own behavior. And from there, those who had once been the loudest became the quietest whenever Grady Locke's name came up. At the final neighborhood meeting, the chairperson proposed removing all records of the lawsuit to start fresh, but an elderly resident spoke up. "If we start over without remembering why we were wrong, what have we learned from it?" No one answered. And so, no signs were taken down. Like Grady, they understood that some things endure not because they're needed, but because they were once denied. The residents who had once opposed him now sometimes stop their cars and stare at the warning signs and nod silently. No more conflict. No need to explain. They just stand there, as he once stood, and as the shadow of what they once believed was their right recedes with every glance backward. But Grady has never taken down a single sign. Because sometimes, leaving a mark untouched is the only way to remind people that some things should never be taken lightly, even if it's too late to make it right. The documentary was filmed over a week, most of it composed of silent frames, the damp forest at dawn, the gravel path leading to the old trail, and Grady's silhouette moving slowly among moss-covered trees. The national broadcaster titled the project, "The Man Who Closed a Trail and Reopened a Boundary," as a way to acknowledge that what Grady did went far beyond closing off a path. The crew had expected him to decline like every other request, but Grady simply said, "I'm not going to speak. If you want to record something, record the silence." They followed him on his early morning patrols, when dew still clung to every blade of grass. He stopped at wooden boundary markers, adjusted a camera's angle, picked up a discarded bottle from the brush, then moved on. Not a single comment. When they asked, "Are you angry?" Grady looked toward the forest and replied, "The trees don't need anyone to take their side, but once they're encroached upon, someone has to stand there." One scene showed Grady in front of the sign that read, "This land was never yours. You just got used to taking," gently touching the weathered edge before walking away. The director asked, "Why not take it down, now that everything's over?" Grady answered, "I don't think something that was once true should be erased just because it makes people uncomfortable." It was the first time a general audience heard his voice low, steady, without persuasion, and entirely without anger. When the documentary aired, thousands of comments poured in. Some praised him, some called him isolated, some said he was stubborn. But it was his final response that left the deepest silence. "Why not forgive? I didn't accuse anyone. I just didn't open the door again." That answer wasn't an indictment, nor a heavy-handed refusal. It was the assertion of a boundary. When people have crossed a line too many times, closing the door is no longer punishment, it's self-preservation. Not to retaliate, but to protect what never should have been taken in the first place. Immediately after the broadcast, the volume of interview requests for Grady spiked. but all were declined. His secretary issued one brief reply to the press. He's not seeking attention, he just wants people to understand where the boundary lies. Independent outlets began writing about the concept of a forest keeper, not in the forestry sense, but as a new symbol, someone who stands not to declare, but to quietly halt intrusion cloaked as community interest. They asked, how many other Grady-type figures are quietly guarding land, upholding boundaries not through law, but by personal resolve? A Western university added Grady's story to its syllabus on land policy and social justice, making his phrase, "I didn't fight back, I stood still," one of the key citations on ownership and communal limits. What students debated most wasn't the legal conflict, but how someone held a line without harming anyone. No gun was fired, no threat was carried out, but the boundary was restored through persistence so undeniable that no one could argue it anymore. Grady did not oppose those who returned to the forest, as long as they asked for permission. He guided small student groups through the new entrance, explaining native plant species, how to read animal tracks, but never once spoke about the lawsuit. When a professor asked about the possibility of reopening the trail someday, he simply shook his head. Once someone walks into your house and says, "This is a public hallway, would you leave the door open the next night?" The question demanded no answer, but it left the group silent for a long time. At one stop along the journey, where the trailhead used to be, a small handmade sign was posted by the students, written in white paint. "Respect doesn't need permission, but trespassing does." The phrase wasn't a quote from Grady, but everyone understood it came from his story. And beneath it, a small signature, in honor of the man who never shouted, but was always heard. Grady didn't come to see it, but the trip guide later shared that the sign was still there the next morning, and beside it was a stone, an old one, recognizable as having once sat in the garden behind Mr. Locke's house. No note, no one claimed it was his, but for those who knew the story, it was his way of saying, "I saw it." And so he remained the forest's keeper not through authority, but through a presence that made others self-correct. Karen left the state on a morning no one noticed. A moving truck arrived, loaded sealed boxes with no labels, and departed before the sun crested the ridge. There was no farewell letter, no explanation. The house that once held a brass nameplate at the gate now showed only a bare wooden frame. Though no criminal charges were ever filed, her reputation was erased from the community, not by attack, but by the silence of those who once stood with her. The words she had spoken in meetings, once carefully recorded and quoted like directives, had vanished from HOA documents, no longer cited in minutes, no longer referenced in disputes. Karen's departure didn't bring joy, but it didn't leave sorrow either. Those who had signed in her support now avoided her name at meetings, while those who had stayed silent exhaled as if freed from a long burden. They didn't condemn her, didn't delete old posts, they simply stopped mentioning her as if she'd never existed in the role of community leader. Karen once said, "We don't need guns, we need control." But it was that control that made her a symbol of distorted authority. The silence she once used to hold her place had now become what erased her from collective memory. Instead, they proposed that those areas be managed solely by the Land Registry Office, with absolute respect for private ownership. No one objected. A few middle-aged residents nodded quietly, as if acknowledging that what they once supported no longer made sense. The new name for the organization was chosen as Civic Harmony Board. No more authority, no more power to regulate space. The revised bylaws emphasize mediation, support, and transparency, not enforcement. The meeting ended earlier than in previous years, with no floral arrangements, no refreshments, and only a handwritten sign hung behind the secretary's desk. Living together doesn't mean defining each other. The sign, "No community trail beyond this point," remained at the old trailhead. The scrawled line underneath, "Maybe we never had one," was widely photographed as a reminder. It was not just the mark of a dispute, but proof of a time when people casually called something public, as long as they felt entitled to it. The restructuring of the HOA brought no celebration. It marked the end of a once trusted way of operating, now replaced by rules with less authority but more boundaries. No one was allowed to speak for the collective will to encroach on private land, and no one could use the word community as a weapon anymore. The only person who said nothing during the restructuring event was Grady. He didn't attend, didn't send a letter, but people still looked toward the eastern forest, where there was now no entrance, no signs. The trees grew thicker than before, covering all trace of the old trail, and in that way, the once contested land returned to its own rhythm, quiet, claimed by no one. Karen's departure without indictment left some feeling unfinished. But over time, people came to understand, punishment doesn't have to come from a court. When no one listens, when no one believes, what remains of someone who once held power is just the void left by being forgotten. The loss of reputation in this case was the only sentence, and the heaviest one. As for Grady, he still lived the same way, rising early, walking the forest perimeter, and responding to no reporters. But every time someone passed by, they could feel that peace had returned to the place where the conflict once stood, not because someone won, but because the last man standing was the one who never crossed the line. A local newspaper, which had remained silent throughout the season of conflict, unexpectedly published a lengthy article with a sarcastic headline, "Karen didn't lose because Grady fired. She lost because he never had to." The piece opened with the image of a man standing in the woods, unarmed, not rallying, with only warning signs as the final language left in a community that had grown used to equating silence with consent. The journalist described, "He didn't speak, didn't react, didn't resist." And that's exactly what made those accustomed to steering crowds feel unsafe. The white-painted words on wooden boards rewrote the rules more clearly than any document could. No one had the right to enter a place simply because they were used to walking through it, and no one had the authority to define what was shared without first asking the true owner. Below the article, a quote from a state university law professor received over 3,000 shares. "This is a textbook example of the boundary between community and individual when people forget that law does not serve emotion. The right not to be violated is a fundamental right, and that doesn't depend on how agreeable or contributive the owner is." He emphasized that Karen and the HOA's behavior was typical of a governance model that used the guise of collective interest to impose personal silence. But that silence, when sustained long enough and upheld with resolve, became untouchable. The phrase, "law does not serve emotion," was cited across many forums and became a common sticker on cars, laptops, and even on the iron gates of a few homes near the forest. Many residents began to reflect on the months when they had dismissed the dispute as insignificant or petty. An elderly woman shared during a community meeting, "I used to think I knew that forest, but now I realize I only knew the path through it, not the person who kept it intact from the beginning." Her words drew no applause, but left behind a long silence. This time, the silence of realization. A group of sociology students centered their final thesis on the case. They titled their research, "Nature is Not Always Community." In their final analysis, they argued that true mutual respect doesn't come from meetings or rule boards, from the ability to step back when facing a boundary, whether visible or invisible. Grady's boundary wasn't in a fence, but in his refusal to step outside his principles. He didn't advance, didn't speak out, didn't confront. But each time the HOA pushed forward, he stepped back, just enough to make clear his silence wasn't consent. A photograph of Grady walking through the forest, with the faded "I stood still" sign in the background, was chosen as the cover image for the national broadcast's feature on private property rights in modern society. The article's author closed with a single line, "In a world where everything demands to be shared, sometimes what we most need to protect is the right to keep something private." Grady didn't respond to anyone about the article, but a week later, along a small path near the forest's edge, a new sign appeared. On rough wooden planks, white paint spelled out a small line, "Respect is not instinct, it's taught by boundaries." No one knew when Grady had written it, and no one dared to touch it, because by then, they understood respect is not natural, but the result of boundaries drawn clearly, then upheld by a lifetime of someone who never retreated, never attacked, just stood still without stepping back. Grady wrote that piece on a night of light rain, with only the sound of leaves brushing the tin roof and the glow of a yellow light flickering from a distant hillside. No media outlet commissioned it, no journalist got an exclusive interview. The piece was posted directly to his personal page, which had sat empty for years, the same place he once used to share photos of forest trails after the leaves changed each season. Just 8 paragraphs long, it opened with a sentence that made thousands of readers pause. "I never called this a victory. I just reclaimed what once belonged to my father." There was no justification, no bitterness, and certainly no gloating. He recounted childhood mornings spent following his father collecting pine cones, afternoons climbing hills to fix fence posts after storms. Those paths had no names, but they connected 3 generations. The map the HOA once mocked was a hand-drawn sketch in bleeding black ink on faded yellow paper, but those winding lines, as Grady wrote, were "the breath of my family during the years no one listened." Alu, he didn't mention Karen, didn't mention the HOA, and didn't try to explain why he held on to the land. He simply recorded the moments when the line between entitlement and familiarity began to blur. From the morning his hunting dog was poisoned, to the night a camera caught someone climbing over the warning sign just to get some fresh air. Each detail was told as if the writer was stepping back, letting the reader move forward and come to their own understanding. The post ended with a final line in italics. "It's not revenge, it's return." 6 words, without anger or apology, but carrying the weight of someone who had stood far too long on the border between holding on and letting go. That italic line was shared everywhere, engraved in wood, printed on t-shirts, used as an email signature as a reminder to anyone who ever thought silence meant weakness. The piece didn't trend, wasn't read aloud on television, but it was archived in the state library as a document of modern civil conflict. A social sciences scholar left a note in the margin. In an era where every disagreement becomes a battlefield, this man chose to hold his ground and by doing so, made the whole world pause and look. From then on, Grady's image was no longer that of a man with a rifle in the woods, but of a man who stood still when everything around him demanded he pick a side. Even so, Grady did not reappear. He didn't respond to messages, nor did he attend any memorials or award ceremonies. But on an early autumn day, a new sign was found at the intersection where the fiercest disputes had once taken place. There was no warning, no bold white paint, just a piece of raw wood, carved with 6 recessed words: "Return what was never yours again." The letters were uneven, as if carved by hand. People passing by stopped for longer, some bowing their heads quietly, as if they had just walked past something once denied and now being returned, not as a debt, but as something that had been wrong to take in the first place. By this point, the story was no longer about land, about laws, or about the HOA, but about the fragile line between ownership and the right to be left alone, and those who chose to preserve silence as a final way to reclaim what had once belonged to them. One early winter morning, while the mist still clung to the tree canopy, Grady rolled up his sleeves to clear the trail winding through the old hillside. It wasn't because anyone was coming, nor to welcome anything new. He just saw layers of yellow leaves so thick that the familiar shape of the path was lost, and sometimes preserving something begins with the smallest act sweeping away what has fallen. He worked quietly, each stroke steady, like a simple ritual that needs no explanation. The ground beneath the leaves still bore the clear footprints of those who'd come before generations, who built homes, camped, and left behind memories, things no law could ever claim ownership of. Just as he stood wiping sweat from his brow, a boy paused at the forest's edge. Light from the right cast his shadow on the earth, like a streak of time Grady once recognized within himself. The boy looked about 8, curiosity mixed with hesitation in his eyes. Hesitating, he asked, "I used to walk here with my mom. Could I walk a bit now?" The question held no hidden agenda, no special claim, nor the echoes of the recent disputes. It was so pure that Grady nearly fell silent for a few seconds, making sure he wasn't imagining it. He looked at the boy, then down the cleared path where warning signs once stood, where some had stepped with defiance rather than respect. No warnings remained, only clean, quiet earth. Grady nodded slowly, saying nothing. The boy smiled and stepped onto the trail, each step light as if afraid to disturb the plants. He neither ran nor shouted, walking only as far as promised, then turned back, bowed his head, and said, "Thank you." That was enough. Nothing was taken, nothing needed asking for. As the boy left, Grady watched, then turned inside to finish clearing the rest of the trail. This wasn't a gesture of approval, nor an apology. It was something deeply human, the silence allowing another to move forward without paying for the mistakes of the grown-ups. That afternoon, a woman left a small paper package by the edge of the fence, no name, no note. Inside was a jar of wild honey and a shaky, handwritten note. Sometimes leaving something isn't to demand, but just to let someone know they're still remembered. Grady did not respond, nor did he turn on the cameras to find the sender. He simply placed the jar on a wooden shelf inside, beside worn bullet casings and his father's tin box of maps, things with no market value, but carrying every reason he'd never leave this forest. As the sun set, the shadow of the wooden gate stretched across the slope. The gate was unlocked but not open. The chain hung loose, the faded sign weathered by sun and rain like a memory no longer debated. Passers-by no longer stopped to protest or ask for permission. They stopped to look, and sometimes, just looking is a form of respect. Grady still lived there, still guarded the forest, not as a victor, but as a keeper of what others had once forgotten was important. And so the path was neither opened nor closed. It simply existed, like a fold in the town's memory, as long as there were people quiet enough to walk through it without thinking they were taking something. As the old saying goes, there are lands no one owns, only those who know how to. And Grady was exactly that kind of person. Grady nodded, his eyes fixed on the boy's face. If you know where to go, no one needs to show you the way. The words carried no lecturing tone, nor did they feel like permission. They were as simple as how people who've lived their whole lives with the forest speak, never trying to teach, only letting others understand for themselves. The boy looked at Grady for a moment longer, then nodded softly back. His foot pressed into the soft moss as he stepped among the straight tree trunks, as if he'd always belonged there. No signs forbidding entry, no warnings, no invisible fences between old and new generations, all replaced by silence, a silence once mistaken for refusal, but actually the quietest form of agreement. Grady stood still, neither following nor turning back inside. He simply watched the small boy's figure fade between thick layers of leaves, where morning light still shimmered like streaks of silver ink. A gentle breeze rustled some branches, and the only sound was the boy's steady footsteps, not rushed, not hesitant, like walking into an untold memory that could still be understood. He thought of his father, who once led him over slippery hills in the rain, speaking little, only resting a hand on his shoulder. Lessons on boundaries, life, and holding on, never written into law. They only existed when someone chose to stand firm amid conflict and say, "This is mine, but that doesn't mean it must be taken." That was something he had never spoken aloud during the years of lawsuits, questioning, and misunderstanding. But today, watching a child walk the trail without intent to seize, he knew everything remained intact. No camera recorded that moment. No one posted online to say, "The he-man once accused of threatening neighbors has now allowed a boy into the woods." There was no need for a touching ending. Sometimes, the fact that no one saw makes the moment even more important. It exists not to prove anything, but to be remembered on some future day when they're older, or when the world feels crowded again with invisible rules. Grady turned his back, lifted a fallen branch blocking the path, and set it aside. He didn't clear the way or block it. He simply did what was needed so no one would trip even if they never saw him. Protection sometimes isn't about stopping others, but making sure someone can keep moving forward without fear. As dusk fell, the light slowed through the leaves more than usual. Grady lingered a moment longer before quietly heading back. No one asked questions, no meetings awaited, everything was silent. And in that silence, something shifted, not power, nor boundaries, but the way a community saw itself. The old wooden gate still stood, its paint faded, and the padlock unused. But in the eyes of those who had passed by, argued, mocked, or opposed, the gate had become a symbol not of exclusion, but of limits set by character, not by imposed authority. That day was nothing special, nothing recorded in minutes, yet it was etched deeper than any record in the memory of a child allowed into the forest without asking permission, and in the heart of an adult who once held land through silence. Not out of anger, but from understanding that some things are protected not by words, but by how we live with for a lifetime. Grady Locke never sought attention. He didn't rise to lead a movement, nor did he fight for any victory beyond keeping the land his father left him. From a man living quietly on the forest's edge, he was drawn into a conflict not because he was aggressive, but because he dared to stand still. The story began with a seemingly harmless "no trespassing" sign, a suspicious glance, an unjust fine, then escalated into community division, lawsuits, and finally the collapse of an HOA system built on a sense of ownership. Grady didn't respond with harsh words or resistance. He documented, proved, quietly posted warning signs, and let those who once looked down on him face the truth they tried to hide. Land isn't defined by use, but by bonds formed across generations through responsibility and respect for boundaries. The first sign, "Trespassers may be hunted down," wasn't a threat. It reflected the unease of those who entered the forest, without ever asking whose it really was. From that sign, the truth emerged piece by piece through leaked videos, internal letters, anonymous votes, and signs rewritten with scrawled words by unknown residents. Karen, once the HOA's representative, didn't lose for lack of strategy. She failed because she never understood the limit between community power and personal invasion. When she couldn't buy the land, she sued. When she lost the lawsuit, she painted Grady as a threat. But in the end, she was the one who had to leave, not forced out, but because the values she stood for had lost trust. The collapse of the system began from within, when its own members refused to be exploited for opaque agendas. As for Grady, he stayed put. He still lived in the old house on the forest's edge, surrounded by trails no longer named on community maps. What makes this story endure isn't the legal details or viral social media clips. It's the silence. The silence of a man who didn't retaliate, didn't speak harshly, didn't show up to salvage his image, yet somehow forced an entire state to rethink the meaning of common use right. He didn't win with arguments but by standing his ground. The phrase, "I didn't fight back, I stood still," became a symbol not for its eloquence, but because it reminds us that standing still is an action, and sometimes the most necessary one in a world too quick to shout right or wrong. From that journey, many lessons were learned. That not everyone who stays silent is wrong, and not every claim made in the name of community is justice. That power is fragile, if built only on familiarity and convenience, and that sometimes the kindest thing we can do is pause before stepping onto land that was once someone else's home. Grady's story doesn't end with an award or an apology. It ends with a boy allowed into the forest without promises, and a man who silently watches, not intervening, not stopping him because he knows not every gate needs locking to keep its value. It wasn't a victory, it was a return. And perhaps that more than any grand statement is what makes people stop, look back, and reconsider about boundaries, about silence, about ownership, and about how we treat what isn't ours.